The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Evelyn Hartwell would remember for the rest of her life. Not because Tuesdays meant anything in particular, but because her sister Cordelia had been laughing so hard, she knocked her teacup clean off the parlor table when she slid the envelope across the wood, and the sound of that laughter, bright and cutting and completely without shame, was the last thing Evelyn heard clearly before the world she'd always known began to crack at its foundations. "Go on," Cordelia said, wiping her eyes. "Read it. We did you a favor, Evie. Found you a husband." Beside her, their younger sister Miriam pressed both hands over her mouth, shoulders shaking. Neither of them looked sorry. Neither of them looked anything except delighted. The envelope had already been opened. Of course it had. They'd read it first. Evelyn pulled the letter free and unfolded it, and the handwriting was plain and deliberate, a man unused to writing letters, but determined to write this one correctly. She read it once, then again. Then she set it on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and looked at her sisters. "You sent my name to a stranger," she said. "A rancher," Cordelia corrected, like the distinction mattered. "In Wyoming. He put an advertisement in the paper looking for a wife." She reached across and tapped the letter. "We thought it would be funny. We didn't think he'd actually write back." What they hadn't expected, what neither of them had accounted for, was that the man would say yes. If you've ever been the one your own family used as a punchline, you already know what this story is about. Stay until the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Hartwell house in Clement, Missouri was a beautiful trap. That was the only honest way Evelyn had ever thought about it, though she would never have said so aloud. The house sat on a wide corner lot near the center of town, with a white painted fence her father had put up 20 years ago and maintained with the same obsessive regularity he applied to his business ledgers. The fence was straight and clean. The flower beds were planned by a woman her mother hired every spring. The interior was arranged for visitors, with good furniture placed where it could be admired, and the daughters of the household arranged the same way, positioned to present the best possible impression of the Hartwell name. Evelyn had always been the one they didn't know quite where to put. She was the middle daughter, which in a family like hers meant she was the one who got lost. Cordelia was the eldest, and she had their mother's dark hair and their father's confidence, and she moved through every room like she'd been born, knowing exactly how much space she was entitled to occupy. Miriam was the youngest, small-boned and soft-featured, with a laugh that made men lean forward in their chairs. Both of her sisters had been engaged before they were 22. Both of them had married well, and when they visited home now, they did so as women who had accomplished the primary thing expected of them. Evelyn was 26. She was still in her father's house. She was not ugly. She understood this in a detached, practical way, the same way she understood most things about herself without sentiment and without illusion. She was not beautiful either, not in the way that made rooms go quiet. She was ordinary-looking in a family where ordinary was a kind of failure, with brown hair that wouldn't hold a curl for more than an hour, and eyes the color of creek water in November. She was too tall, and her hands were too large, and she had never learned to hold her opinions behind her teeth, the way her mother kept telling her she needed to. That last part was the real problem. The looks she could have survived. The opinions were what kept the suitors away. She had said at a dinner party 2 winters ago that she thought women ought to be permitted to hold property in their own names, without a husband's signature required. She had said it conversationally, not as a proclamation, just as a thought she'd had, while reading a pamphlet someone had left in the church vestibule. The man sitting beside her had gone very still, and then he'd laughed, and then he'd turned to talk to someone else, and he'd never called on her again. Her mother had spoken to her about it afterward, with the particular quiet that was worse than shouting. "You make men uncomfortable," her mother had said. "You don't mean to, but you do." "I was only saying what I think." "I know. That's the problem." By the time she was 25, her family had largely stopped arranging introductions for her. Her father had begun referring to her, in the gentle, abstracted way of a man who didn't know how to be cruel directly, as his scholarly one, which was not a compliment, dressed as one. Her sisters had a name for her between themselves. She'd heard it once. Through a door she wasn't supposed to be standing near, and the name was the leftover. Not said with malice, exactly. Said with the breezy certainty of women who had secured their futures and could afford to find the unsecured ones faintly amusing. Evelyn did not cry about it. She had cried about it once, years ago, and decided it hadn't helped enough to be worth repeating. Instead, she read. She kept the household accounts when her mother's headaches made it impossible, and she kept them better than her mother ever had, catching 3 errors in the butcher's invoices over the course of a single winter. She helped her father sort correspondence during the weeks when his secretary was ill. She learned things constantly, because learning was the one thing she could do that no one had told her yet was unattractive. None of that had translated into a husband. The advertisement, she learned later, had appeared in the back pages of a St. Louis paper that Cordelia received for social news. The advertisement itself was brief. A Wyoming rancher, 34 years of age, owner of substantial property, seeking a wife of practical temperament and honest character. Correspondence welcomed. Inquire to C. Vane, Larimer County, Wyoming Territory. Cordelia had been visiting for the week, using the guest room at the back of the house, and she'd found the paper on a Tuesday morning. And by Tuesday afternoon, she and Miriam, who had come for lunch and stayed, had composed a letter in Evelyn's name and posted it before supper. They had not used Evelyn's real handwriting. Cordelia had written it. They had kept the wording plain, almost plain enough to be dull, thinking plainness would be the thing that made the rejection come fastest. They described Evelyn honestly, her age, her appearance, her lack of any particular accomplishments of the decorative variety. They had not described her intelligence or her capability because it hadn't occurred to them that those things were worth mentioning. And then they had waited, expecting nothing. Because, of course, a man advertising in a paper for a wife was a man who could afford to be selective, and a plain, opinionated, 26-year-old woman with no special charms was exactly the kind of applicant who would receive a polite decline within the fortnight. The reply had come in 3 weeks. It was not a decline. Evelyn read it 3 times at the parlor table while her sisters watched. The man Colton Vane had written plainly. He was not romantic about it. He did not describe himself in flattering terms or make promises he might not keep. He said he had a working ranch of 800 acres in northern Wyoming, that he had 1 son, age 7, from his first marriage, and that his wife had died 2 years prior of a fever that had moved through the valley. He said he was not looking for romance. He was looking for someone willing to work, willing to learn, and willing to be honest. He said the solicitor he'd received. The letter Cordelia had written in Evelyn's name had struck him as more honest than most of what he'd been sent, and he would like to correspond further if she was willing, with the possibility of meeting in the spring. He had signed it, respectfully, Colton Vane. Evelyn looked up from the letter. Miriam was still pressing her hands to her mouth, though she'd stopped laughing now. Cordelia had composed herself into something closer to curiosity. "Well," Cordelia said, "that's unexpected." "You're going to write him back," Evelyn said. "It wasn't a question. We thought you would. It's your name." Evelyn folded the letter. "It wasn't my letter." "No," Cordelia agreed. "But it worked, didn't it? In a manner of speaking." She tilted her head the way she did when she was being generous and wanted you to notice. Could write to him. Explain it was a mistake. He'd understand. Or she smiled you could let it go on a little longer. Just to see, she meant. Just to see how long it takes for him to realize he's made an error in judgment. She meant it will be funny. She meant underneath all of it, you are not the kind of woman a serious man chooses on purpose. Evelyn said nothing. She put the letter in her pocket and went upstairs. She did not sleep well that night. She wrote to him herself. This was the first decision she made that was entirely her own. She sat at the small writing desk in her room, with the door closed and the lamp turned up, and she wrote the letter that Cordelia had not written. She told him the truth, all of it, that the initial letter had not been sent by her, that it had been composed without her knowledge by family members who thought the exercise would be amusing, and that she had only now become aware of his response. She told him he owed her no further correspondence, and she would not hold him to any expectation created by a letter she hadn't written. Then she paused, pen hovering, and wrote one more paragraph. She wrote that she had read his letter carefully, and that she found it, she chose the word, deliberately credible. That she was 26 years old, and unlikely to receive many more genuine offers of any kind. That she was capable of managing household accounts, had some knowledge of livestock from a summer spent at her uncle's farm in her teens, could cook competently if not brilliantly, and was willing to learn whatever she did not already know. That she was not delicate. That she was not particularly agreeable in the ways that men usually meant when they said they wanted an agreeable woman. That she would rather be honest about this than have him discover it later. She signed it, Evelyn Hartwell, Clement, Missouri. She posted it before she could change her mind. His reply arrived in 12 days. It was longer than the first letter. He said he appreciated the honesty and that given the choice between someone willing to lie prettily and someone willing to tell him the truth plainly, he would choose plain truth every time and twice on Sundays. He said the description of her capabilities was more useful to him than a list of accomplishments in music or French. He said he had no illusions about what he was offering, a hard life on difficult land with a child who was still grieving and a ranch that needed more hands than he currently had. He said she should think about it carefully, because once the decision was made and she'd come west, the returning would be expensive and complicated, and he did not say this to pressure her, but to make sure she understood what she was considering. Then, at the end, he'd written, "I don't think a woman who writes a letter like yours is someone who needs to be protected from the truth. So here it is. I think you'd do well here. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am." Evelyn read that last part 4 times. She did not tell her sisters about the second letter, kept the correspondence to herself through March and into April, writing back and forth with a man she had never met, in a territory she had never visited, about practical things, about weather and livestock, and what he expected of a wife in a working household, and what she expected of a husband, and how they would manage disagreements, which she told him directly that she expected they would have, because she was not a woman who backed down from an argument when she believed she was right. He had written back, "Good. I need someone who argues. Everyone around here agrees with me too fast." She had laughed at that, alone in her room at 10 o'clock at night, and then been surprised by the sound of herself laughing. By April, she had made her decision. She told her mother first, because her mother deserved to hear it directly. Her mother sat with both hands folded in her lap and said nothing for a long moment, and then said Wyoming. "Yes, you've never been west of St. Louis. No, you don't know this man. I know what he's put in his letters. That's more than most women know about their husbands before the wedding." Her mother was quiet again. Then she said he could be anything. Could be a liar. He could, Evelyn agreed. So could any man in this county? Her mother didn't have a response to that. It was the kind of response that stopped conversations, which Evelyn knew was a flaw in her. But she couldn't make herself say something softer when the softer thing wasn't true. Her father took it better than she expected, which was to say. He nodded several times in a serious way and asked about the land acreage and whether the man had any outstanding debts he was aware of, and when Evelyn said she'd asked, and Colton had told her the ranch carried one mortgage, taken out 3 years ago for equipment, currently being repaid on schedule, her father nodded again and said, "At least he's honest about it." Cordelia was the problem. She found out 3 days later through their mother, and she came to Evelyn's room without knocking and stood in the doorway with an expression that had started as amusement and was working its way towards something else. "You're actually going," Cordelia said. "Yes. Because of the letter we sent as a joke. Because of the letters I sent after that. Plural." Cordelia was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn, don't." Evelyn was folding a shirtwaist into her trunk, and she didn't stop doing it. "Whatever you're about to say, don't. You sent that letter to embarrass me. Thought it would prove something. I'm choosing not to let it. Going to say I'm sorry." Evelyn stopped, looked up. Cordelia's expression was difficult to read. She wasn't crying. She didn't do that often, but something in her face had shifted into a register Evelyn hadn't seen from her in years. We didn't think he'd write back. We really didn't. I know. And we didn't think you'd." Cordelia stopped. "Try it again. You could meet someone here. You could." "No," Evelyn said very gently. "I couldn't. And we both know it." She turned back to the trunk. "I'm not angry with you, Cordelia. I'm not going because of you. I'm going because it's the only offer that has ever made sense to me, and I've spent 26 years waiting for something to make sense." Cordelia didn't say anything else. She left after a moment, pulling the door closed softly behind her, which was unusual enough that Evelyn stood still for a moment listening to the silence. Then she kept packing. The train west was 3 days, and 2 nights of country she'd never seen, and Evelyn spent much of it at the window. She had read about the frontier. She had read about Wyoming specifically after the first letter, pulling everything available from the small lending library in Clement, and from her father's shelf of geography texts. She had read about the altitude and the wind and the winters that came hard in October and didn't release their grip until April, sometimes May. She had read about cattle ranching and the particular challenges of running an operation in the Northern Territories and the way that a single bad winter could destroy years of work. She had read all of this and still said yes, which told her something about herself she hadn't entirely known before. The woman who got on the train in Missouri was the same woman who'd always lived in her father's house, careful, competent, and largely invisible. Something had shifted in the doing of it, in the actual purchasing of the ticket and the saying of the goodbyes and the carrying of her own trunk to the platform. Something that felt less like courage and more like the absence of a particular kind of fear, the fear of staying. She had been afraid of leaving. But she had been more afraid of another 10 years in a house where she was the leftover, the scholarly one, the woman they didn't quite know what to do with. Wyoming, she had decided, could not possibly be worse than that. She was not entirely right about this, but she wasn't entirely wrong either. Colton Vane met her at the station in Clearwater, which was the closest town to the ranch, a collection of buildings along a single main road, wood-fronted and practical, with a livery and a general store and a saloon that opened earlier than any respectable establishment should. He was standing on the platform when she stepped off the train, and she recognized him from the description he'd given in one of his letters. Tall, not what you'd call handsome, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that looked like it had spent a great deal of time outdoors in difficult weather. He was younger than she'd expected him to look. That was the first surprise. He looked at her for a moment, a brief, assessing look, not unkind, just direct, and then he took off his hat and said, "Miss Hartwell, Mr. Vane." They shook hands. His hand was calloused and large, and he didn't do the thing men sometimes did, where they gripped more lightly with a woman, compensating for what they assumed was fragility. He just shook her hand like she was a person. She thought, all right, maybe. He carried her trunk without asking, which she let him do, because she wasn't interested in making a point about it when it was a heavy trunk and he was there. He led her to a wagon parked at the edge of the road, hitched to two horses who stood with the patient boredom of animals accustomed to waiting. "How was the journey?" he said. "Long, but I slept well the second night." He nodded. "Good." He helped her up onto the wagon seat and went around to climb up on his side. "Ethan wanted to come. I told him not this time. How is he?" "Quiet." He picked up the reins. "He's a quiet kid. You should know that before you meet him. It's not about you. It's just how he is. I'm fairly quiet myself," Evelyn said. Colton glanced at her sideways. "Your letters didn't seem especially quiet. Letters are different." He made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been amusement, and they pulled out of town onto the open road north. She watched the land as they drove. It was not like Missouri. The sky was enormous in a way that was almost oppressive at first, pressing down on the earth from a height that seemed impossible. The grass was different, shorter, tougher looking, a color between green and gray. The mountains were still distant, but present, permanent looking, the kind of geography that reminded you that you were very small. She did not say any of this aloud because she wasn't sure yet how much of her interior life she wanted to give this man access to. She knew him from letters. She did not yet know him from being in the same space, breathing the same air. That was a different kind of knowing. "The ranch is another hour," Colton said, "give or take." "All right. You can ask questions if you have them." She had approximately 47 questions, but she chose the practical one. "What needs the most attention right now?" "On the ranch." "What's the most pressing problem?" He looked at her again, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "We're low on feedstock, and I've got a fence line on the eastern pasture that needs replacing before fall. The herd is healthy, but we lost 4 head in March to something that moved through, couldn't identify it. The vet came out and wasn't certain." "Did you lose any of the surrounding herd?" "No. Isolated then. Seems like. Probably not contagious. Could be ingestion, something in that pasture they got into." She paused. "Does the eastern pasture border any new land? Any changes in what's growing there?" Colton was quiet for a moment. "There's a parcel to the east that got sold last year. New owner cleared some brush in the fall. Could have disturbed something. Worth looking at the fence line when you're out there. See what's on the other side of it now." He said nothing for several seconds. "Then my foreman said the same thing a month ago." "Smart foreman." "Yeah, he looked at the road. He'll like you." Evelyn was not sure what to do with that, so she said nothing, and they drove north through the enormous afternoon sky, with the mountains getting gradually closer, and the distance between her old life and this one growing longer with every revolution of the wheels. The ranch house was not what she'd imagined, which meant she'd imagined it wrong in both directions at once. It was bigger than she'd expected, a proper 2-story structure, solidly built, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and south side. But it was also emptier than she'd anticipated, in a way that wasn't about furniture or space, but about the particular feeling of a house where someone had stopped caring for it in a specific way. Curtains in the front windows were functional and clean but plain, hung without any thought to the light they might let in. The kitchen, which she saw first, was organized by a man who cooked out of necessity rather than pleasure. Everything in its place, nothing extra, no warmth to the arrangement. There was a cast iron stove that was well maintained, which told her the important things were being attended to, and dishes stacked neatly on open shelves, and a table that could seat 8 but had clearly been set for 2 for a long time. The boy was standing in the kitchen doorway when they came in. He was small for 7, she thought, or maybe just carefully held together in the way children sometimes were when they'd learned that the world could take things away without warning. He had his father's coloring dark hair, dark eyes, but his face was rounder and younger than Colton's had probably ever looked, and he was watching her with an expression of such concentrated assessment that she almost smiled. She did not smile. She thought he would find a smile condescending. "Ethan," Colton said, from behind her, setting her trunk down in the hallway. "This is Miss Hartwell, Evelyn," she said to the boy directly. "If you'd rather use that." Ethan considered this. "Why do you have a trunk that big?" "Because I brought books. They're heavy." "What kind of books?" "History, some natural science. One about livestock diseases, which your father might want to borrow." Ethan's eyes moved to his father and back. "Papa doesn't read much." "Then it's a good thing I do," Evelyn said. Something shifted in the boy's face, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, a small reordering of his expression toward something less guarded. He stepped back from the doorway to let her into the kitchen, which she took as an acceptance of some preliminary kind. Colton showed her the house. It didn't take long. The bedroom she'd be using was upstairs, at the end of the hall, next to a room that had been used for storage and would need to be cleared. His room was on the other side of the house. He'd explained this in the letters. They would share the house, share the table, share the work. They would not share a room until they both chose to, if they ever did. He'd written it with the same directness he brought to everything. "I don't expect more than you're willing to give. I want to be honest about that up front." She had written back, agreed on all counts. Standing now in the hallway of this house that smelled like wood smoke and old hay, and something she couldn't name, she understood that the arrangement was real. She had known it intellectually. It was different to stand inside it. "Supper's usually at 6, Colton said. "I eat with the foreman most nights. You and Ethan if you want to eat with us or separately. Either way works." "Together," Evelyn said. "It's better for the boy." Colton looked at her. "You think so?" "Children do better with consistent shared meals. It gives them structure when other things are inconsistent." She paused. "That's not a criticism. It's just what I've read." "All right," he said. "Together then." He turned towards the stairs. "Get yourself settled. I'll be out in the barn. Ethan can answer questions about the house if you have them." He was at the foot of the stairs when she said, "Mr. Vane." He stopped. "Thank you for the letters," she said. "They were honest. I appreciated that." He stood with his hand on the newel post and looked at her for a moment, and something moved across his face that she couldn't read yet, would learn to read, eventually, but not today. "Same," he said, and then he went out through the back door, letting it close behind him without quite a slam. Evelyn stood in the kitchen of a house in Wyoming she'd never seen a month ago, with a 7-year-old boy watching her from the doorway. "That book about livestock diseases," Ethan said. "Could I look at it too?" Turned to him. "You can read it yourself if you want. It's not particularly difficult." Ethan nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Okay," he said. Then he went to the stove and, with the matter-of-fact competence of a child who'd been doing it for longer than he should have had to, began checking on the pot of stew that had been left to simmer. Evelyn watched him for a moment. Then she went to the shelf and found a spare apron and put it on and went to help him. It was not a fairy tale. She had not expected one. What she had expected was a chance, and a chance was what she had, and she intended to use it with everything she had. The stew needed salt. She added some and tasted it, and added a little more. Outside, the Wyoming sky was beginning to go orange at the edges, the way she'd read about but never seen, and the mountains to the west were darkening into something that looked almost purple. She stood at the window for just a moment because she allowed herself that much. Just a moment looking at the country she'd chosen. Then she turned back to the stove and to the boy who was watching her learn the shape of her new life, and she got to work. The first week was not hard in the way she'd expected. It was hard in the ways she hadn't. She had expected physical difficulty. The work was physical, carrying water, maintaining fires, managing a kitchen designed for a man who cooked as efficiently as possible and moved on. She was not soft. She had kept a large house in Missouri, and she knew what sustained labor felt like in her back and her hands. The ranch house was bigger and more demanding, and the equipment was different, but the fundamental nature of the work was something she understood. What she hadn't expected was the silence between herself and Colton Vane. Not hostile silence. It was important to make that distinction. He was not cold, not contemptuous, not things she'd feared in the dark on the train west. Some man who'd decided on arrival that she was not what he'd wanted and was regretting the arrangement and making her feel it. He was none of those things. He was simply a man who had spent 2 years largely alone, or alone in the way that people who are surrounded by workers and the demands of a large operation are still alone without genuine conversation, without someone to think alongside. And the habit of quiet had settled into him so deeply that he seemed to have forgotten he'd ever operated any other way. He said what needed to be said. He explained things when explanation was useful. He answered her questions directly and without condescension, which she appreciated more than she'd expected to, because she'd anticipated that some element of it would have the quality of instruction given to someone presumed to be slow. It didn't. He talked to her like she was capable of understanding and acting on what she was told, which was a more radical thing than it should have been. The silence was still there, in the evenings, at the table after supper. Ethan ate quickly and disappeared to his room, the way children did when they sensed that the adults in a space needed to negotiate something, and they were better off not being present for it. Colton would sit for a while longer with his coffee, working through some paper or other cattle records, correspondence, something always, and Evelyn would sit with a book or the household ledger she'd asked to take over, and they were in the same room, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it was also not unbearable. She had not expected it to be comfortable. She reminded herself of this. On the fourth evening, she set down her book and said, "Your accounts are carrying an error from February." Colton looked up. The feed invoice from the Garrity supplier. It was recorded twice in the ledger. Small amount, but it'll compound if it runs through to the quarterly summary. Put down his pen. "How'd you find that?" "I've been going through the whole thing to get familiar with the operation." She paused. "I should have asked first. I'll ask in future." "No," he said slowly. "It's you should know the accounts. That was part of what I said I needed." He reached across the table. "Can I see?" She slid the ledger to him, and he looked at the entries she'd marked, frowning slightly at the page. $3.20, he said. "Over time, it matters less than the habit of finding it," Evelyn said. "If there's one error, there might be others. There might be." He looked up at her. "Did you find others?" "2, smaller, I marked them." He looked at the pages for a moment longer, then set the ledger down. He picked up his pen, set it down again. "My wife used to do the accounts," he said. "After she died, I went back to doing them myself. I'm not good at it." The mention of his wife was the first one. She'd been careful not to introduce the subject herself, thinking it was his to bring forward when he was ready. "What was she good at?" Evelyn asked, carefully. "Everything she decided to do." He said it without romance, just fact. "She was stubborn and she was smart, and she didn't back down from things. And she died from a fever that I couldn't stop." He looked at the table. "So I don't talk about her much, because when I do, I feel like I'm trying to explain something I can't explain." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. "I'm not asking you to explain it," she finally said. "I asked what she was good at." He looked at her. "She was good at the accounts," he said. "She was good with Ethan. She was better with people than I am." He picked up the pen again. "That's all I can say right now." "All right," Evelyn said, and opened her book again. They sat in silence for another hour. But it was a slightly different silence than it had been before, and she thought he felt it too, though neither of them said so. The foreman's name was Del Briggs, and he had worked for Colton Vane for 11 years, which meant he had also worked for Colton's first wife, and he had the particular loyalty of a man who had watched a good operation go through catastrophic loss and survive it. He was in his mid-40s, compact and weathered, with a straightforward manner that stopped just short of bluntness. He had watched Evelyn for the first 3 days, with the careful attention of a man deciding whether a new tool was going to be useful or was going to break under the first real pressure. On the 4th day, she'd come out to the eastern pasture with Colton to look at the fence line, because she'd said she wanted to understand the layout of the operation. She'd watched and listened, and asked 2 questions that were both precise enough that Del had answered them. Without slight pause, he'd been inserting before his answers to her, the one that meant he was deciding how much to simplify. After that, he'd talk to her like he talked to Colton, which she understood was a significant concession. But you know anything about cattle work? He asked her, the morning of the second week, when she came out to watch the hands move part of the herd between pastures. I know what I've read. And a summer at my uncle's farm, but he ran sheep, not cattle. Principles overlap, but not entirely. What's the biggest difference? She thought about it honestly. Cattle don't stay in a group the same way. They drift. Sheep you can move with pressure from the edges. Cattle you need to manage from the point and the flank both. Dell looked at her for a moment. That's right, he said, sounding slightly surprised. I read carefully, she said. He almost smiled. You're going to be all right here, he said, in the tone of a man who didn't give that assessment lightly. She thought she might be, she was not certain, but she thought so. Problem with the town came at the end of the second week. She'd gone in with Colton to the general store they needed supplies, and he'd offered to take her, so she could establish accounts and know the layout of the place. The woman behind the counter was named Mrs. Alcott, and she had the efficient friendliness of someone who managed a great deal of business through her establishment and was careful to be pleasant to all of it. She had been pleasant to Evelyn. The two women, talking near the back of the store, had been less careful. Evelyn had been looking at bolts of fabric. Ethan's jacket was getting too small, and she'd been thinking about making him a new one, and the conversation drifted to her in pieces, the way conversations did when they weren't meant to be heard, but weren't actually being kept quiet either. Vane's new wife, mail order, I heard. She's not what I expected. Plain looking. His first wife was very beautiful. Yes. Poor man. The poor man was 10 feet away, Evelyn noted, buying flour and probably not listening, because Colton had the focused attention of someone thinking about what he needed to accomplish and not much else. Kept her face toward the fabric bolts and her expression neutral. I suppose he needed someone practical, the first voice continued. With the boy in the ranch, he probably wasn't looking for. She let the rest of it blur into the sounds of the store. She had heard it before in different forms in Clement. The particular sympathy extended to men who had to settle for less. The particular certainty among women who had husbands they'd chosen conventionally that the arrangement was its own kind of commentary on the woman involved. She bought the fabric. She made her accounts with Mrs. Alcott, who was still pleasant and meant it. She walked back to the wagon with Colton and said nothing about it. He looked at her sideways as they loaded the wagon. You heard something. She looked at him. What makes you say that? You've got to look. What look? Like you're deciding not to react to something. She considered denying it. She decided not to. I'm fine, she said. I've been plain my entire life. I'm not surprised that people notice. He was quiet for a moment, stacking supplies in the wagon bed. Then he said, they don't know you. No, she said. They don't. They will, he said. And he said it, simply, without ceremony, as a statement of fact rather than a comfort, and somehow that was the version of it she found she could actually hold on to. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and looked out at the main road of Clearwater and the mountains beyond it, and she thought, all right, time then. She had time. She had chosen to come here, and she had chosen to stay, and she had work to do, and a boy to look after, and a household to run, and a ledger to fix, and an eastern fence line to think about, and the opinions of two women in a general store were not going to take any of that away from her. She picked up the ledger from where she'd left it on the seat and opened it to the page she'd marked. Colton climbed up beside her and picked up the reins and looked at her with the book open in her lap. You work everywhere, he said. The wagon takes an hour, she said. That's a lot of time to waste. He made the sound again, the one that might be amusement. Then he turned the horses north, toward home. She kept her eyes on the ledger for the first 10 minutes. Then she let herself look up at the country spreading out around them, vast and indifferent, and completely unlike anything she'd ever known, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't say that aloud. It was too early for that kind of certainty. Kept it. She kept it, and she turned back to the page, and she kept working. Third week began the way most weeks did on the Vane ranch, with something breaking before sunrise. It was the water pump on the south side of the barn, which had been making a sound for the better part of 4 days, that Del Briggs had described as complaining, and Colton had described as fine for now, and Evelyn had described, in the household ledger she'd started keeping notes in, as requires attention before failure. She'd written that on a Tuesday. The pump failed on a Friday, at 5:30 in the morning, when 3 of the hands were trying to water the horses before the day's work started, and the handle simply gave way with a sound like a rifle shot in the cold air. She heard it from the kitchen, where she was already up and starting the stove. Heard the sound. And then she heard Dell's voice carrying across the yard with a word she was going to pretend she hadn't heard. And then the boots on the porch. Colton came in through the back door with his jacket half-buttoned and his hair not yet sorted, and the expression of a man who had already diagnosed the problem and was working through its consequences. "Pump," he said. "I heard. She moved the kettle. How bad?" "Seal's gone. Maybe the shaft too won't know until Dell gets into it." He went to the hook by the door for his work coat. "We'll have to haul water from the creek until it's fixed. It's half a day of labor I don't have. I can haul." He looked at her. "I can haul water," she said again, in the tone she used when she was not asking permission. "I'm not going to pretend the creek is on the other side of the territory. 200 yards. Give me a yoke and I can do 3 trips while the men are doing other things. It's heavy." "Yes, it is." She poured the hot water into the teapot and set it on the table. "Is there a reason I can't do it? Or are you looking for one?" Colton stood with his coat in his hands and looked at her for a moment. The look she was starting to be able to read, the one where he was deciding whether he was about to be wrong about something. He had that look more than most men she'd known, which was either a character strength or evidence that he encountered more situations than average where being wrong was a possibility. "There's a yoke on the barn wall," he said. "Briggs will show you the buckets." "Thank you." He went back out. She drank her tea standing up because there wasn't time to sit, and then she went to find the yoke. That was how the 3rd week started. It did not get substantially easier from there. The hauling took 2 hours, spread across the morning in trips between the kitchen work and the other things that needed doing. Her shoulders ached by the 2nd trip and burned by the 4th, and by the time Dell had the pump dismantled enough to assess the damage, she had moved enough water to satisfy the immediate need, and was at the kitchen table with her sleeves rolled up and her arms feeling like they'd been replaced with something less cooperative. Ethan found her there. He'd started doing this, appearing in the kitchen at the moments when she was between tasks, not to help exactly, and not to talk, but to be present in the way that children were sometimes present when they were working something out. He'd sit at the other end of the table with whatever he'd been doing, a book, a piece of whittling he'd started that was supposedly going to be a horse, a page of arithmetic his father had assigned him, and he'd work on it. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't. "Your arms hurt," he said, looking at her. "Yes." "Because of the water hauling." Yes, he considered this. Papa usually has Pete do the water hauling when something breaks. Pete was fixing the fence on the north pasture this morning. It made more sense for me to do it. Ethan looked at the table. "Mama used to say that making sense of something isn't the same as being glad about it." Evelyn stopped. She looked at him carefully. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother directly to her, not around her, not in an offhand way, but to her face, with that particular quality of a child testing whether a thing is safe to say. "Your mother was right," Evelyn said. "I'm not particularly glad about my arms right now. The horses needed water." He nodded, satisfied with that. "She used to haul water too, when things broke." He turned back to his arithmetic page. "Papa says she wasn't supposed to, but she did anyway." "That sounds like a sensible woman." "She was," Ethan said, in the simple way of a child who doesn't yet have the adult impulse to soften grief into something more manageable. She was very sensible and funny. She was funnier than Papa. "Most people are funnier than your father." Ethan looked up, startled. Evelyn raised an eyebrow at him. That was a joke. Stared at her for another moment. And then he laughed, a real one, short and surprised, like he'd been caught off guard by it. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. Actually laugh. And it changed his face entirely, made him look his age instead of older. "Papa's not that bad," he said, composing himself. "No, he's not." She began rolling her sleeves back down. "He's just not especially funny. That's not the same as bad." Ethan considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. "He laughed once at something you said last week." "Supper." "Did he? You said something about the feed supplier's invoice and you called it." Ethan squinted, remembering you said it was creative arithmetic, and he made that sound. "What sound?" "The one that's almost a laugh, but he doesn't finish it." Evelyn understood exactly the sound he meant. "I'll take it," she said. Ethan went back to his arithmetic. Evelyn started on the bread dough that needed to go in before midday, and they worked in companionable quiet for a while. The fire in the stove, making the kitchen warmer than the rest of the house, kind of warmth that settled into a room and made it feel briefly like a place rather than just a structure. She was not his mother. She was not trying to be. But she was beginning to understand what he needed from her, which was less mothering and more steadiness. Someone who showed up consistently, answered questions directly, and didn't flinch when he mentioned the woman who had died. She could do that. She was building the practice of it, the same way she was building every other practice here, deliberately, without rushing, one morning at a time. Pump repair took most of the day and cost them more than Colton had hoped, because the shaft was indeed damaged, and the part that needed replacing had to be sourced from town. Dell drove in that afternoon and came back with the part and the information that it had cost $11, which Evelyn noted in the ledger without comment. Colton looked at the entry later that evening and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "We need to order the repair on the eastern fence line before that becomes $11 too." "I know," Evelyn said. "I've been costing it out. It's here." She turned the ledger page and pushed it toward him. He looked at what she'd written. A breakdown of materials needed, estimated labor hours from the hands already employed versus the cost of bringing in additional labor, a comparison of two approaches to the repair. At the bottom, she'd noted which approach she thought made more sense and why. Colton read it twice. "You got all this from the ledger, and what Dell told you?" "And from looking at the fence section myself on Thursday. You went out to the eastern pasture. You weren't using the gray mare. I asked Pete if he minded me taking her for an hour, and he said no." Colton set the ledger down. He had the look again, the one she'd come to think of as his recalculation expression, like a man who'd built a structure in his head, and was now finding that the actual dimensions were different than the plan. "I was going to look at it this weekend," he said. "I know. I thought if I looked first I could tell you what I saw and save you some of the time. And which approach do you think makes more sense?" She'd written it in the ledger, but she answered him directly, because she thought he asked things aloud when he wanted to hear how a person reasoned, not just what they concluded. She walked him through it the cost difference, the time factor, the longer-term durability of the more expensive option versus the short-term fix, what she'd observed about the soil conditions near the eastern boundary that made the cheaper post option less reliable. When she finished, Colton said, "That's what Dell's been saying for 2 months. Then you should probably listen to both of us." Something moved in his face that she still couldn't entirely name. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." He picked up the ledger and handed it back. "Do the order Monday. I'll let Dell know." She took the ledger. "All right." He stood, took his coffee cup to the counter. Then, without turning around, he said, "You're better at this than you told me you'd be." She thought about several responses and chose the honest one. "I didn't know yet what better looked like here. Now I do." He didn't say anything else. He went upstairs. She sat at the table for a while longer, going through the next week's supply needs with the lamp turned up, and she let herself feel, quietly and without making much of it, she had done a good day's work in a place that was beginning to feel like hers. Marcus Crowe arrived in Clearwater at the end of October, and the town noticed. He came with 2 men and a wagon full of surveying equipment, and a manner that was polished in the specific way of someone who had learned that polish was a more efficient tool than bluntness in most situations. He was not from Wyoming. He was from Denver, or said he was, and he bought drinks at the saloon on his first evening and talked about land investment and railroad expansion and the future of the Northern Territories with the fluency of a man who had given the same speech in enough different towns to have it memorized. Dell brought the news back from town on a Thursday, the way Dell brought most news as information, without visible alarm, but with the particular quality of attention that meant he thought it was worth noting. "Crow," Colton said. He said the name like he recognized it. "You know him?" "I know of him. He's been buying up smaller operations down near the southern boundary of the county. Couple of families sold to him last spring, Henderson's and the McCrae widow." He set down the harness he'd been working on. "What's he want up here?" "Hard to say. He's talking general about investment, but he was asking questions about the water rights on the North Fork." Colton went still in the way he did when something concerned him, not agitated, just very quiet, like all his energy had been redirected inward. What was he asking? "Alcott at the store and Tom Whitfield." Dell paused. "Whitfield's been having a rough season." Colton picked up the harness again. "I'll ride into town tomorrow." Evelyn heard this conversation from the kitchen doorway, where she'd come to ask Dell about the feed delivery she was expecting. She waited until Dell had gone back to the barn and then came into the room. "Who is Marcus Crowe?" she asked. Colton looked at her. He'd stopped being surprised by the fact that she asked direct questions, but she thought sometimes he was still deciding how direct his answers needed to be. "A landman," he said. The kind that comes in and identifies operations that are struggling and makes offers that look good until the ink's dry. And the water rights on the North Fork are important. They're what makes this ranch viable in a dry year. If someone controls the upstream access on the North Fork, they control who can use the water downstream. He set the harness on the hook by the door. It's not a new strategy. It's been used down south for 30 years. Is Whitfield likely to sell? Colton was quiet for a moment. Tom's a good man, but he's had 2 hard years back-to-back and he's got a family. A man in that position sometimes can't afford to wait for the long view. Evelyn thought about this. What happens to us if he does? Depends on what Crow does with it. If he's smart, and he is, or he wouldn't still be at it, he doesn't move fast. He acquires the position and waits. Then in a dry year, when people need the water, he's in a position to negotiate terms. What kind of terms? The kind that eventually turn a neighbor into a tenant. He looked at her steadily. It's not a crisis yet, but it's worth watching. She nodded. Then could we buy the north parcel instead? Before Crow does. Colton looked at her for a moment. It's not for sale. It might be if Whitfield is struggling. You said he's had 2 bad years. If he's considering offers, he might consider yours before Crow's, if you approach him the right way. I don't have cash to buy land right now. No. But you have the equipment loan almost paid down another 8 months, from what I can see in the ledger. If you offered a structured arrangement, something that gave Whitfield relief in the short term without requiring you to pay the full amount immediately. She paused. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know enough about how these arrangements work here, but it might be worth talking to someone who does. Colton was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. It was not the recalculation expression. It was something quieter. I've been thinking about that parcel for 2 years, he said. Haven't moved on it because I didn't have the leverage. You might have more than you think. He picked up his hat from the table. I'll talk to Tom Whitfield before I go to the bank, he said. That's the right order. He paused at the door. How'd you know to think about the upstream position? You explained it clearly, she said, and I read. He almost smiled. The almost was getting more frequent. Yeah, he said, you do. And he went out. She went into town herself on the Friday, not with Colton but with Dell, who was picking up the supply order she'd placed. She had her own errand, a conversation she'd decided to have with Mrs. Alcott at the general store, because Mrs. Alcott knew everyone and everything in Clearwater, and Evelyn had concluded that this was a resource she should be actively cultivating rather than simply encountering. The conversation began as practical commerce confirming the order, discussing what needed to be added for the coming month, and moved gradually into the kind of talk that Mrs. Alcott was clearly skilled at managing, the exchange of information that a community like Clearwater ran on. Evelyn asked questions carefully, not about Crow directly, but about the general state of things in the valley, about which families had had good seasons and which had struggled, about the railroad rumors that had been circulating since August. Mrs. Alcott was sharp enough to understand that the questions weren't idle. She answered them with a precision that told Evelyn she'd made a decision to be useful. Whitfield's not the only one who's had it hard, Mrs. Alcott said, wrapping the last of the order. The Pierce brothers lost their lease on the south pasture land in the spring. They're working for wages now, which is not what they expected. She tied the string around the paper package. Crow's been to see them too, according to what I hear. What does he want from the Pierce brothers? Access. Mainly. Their property sits between 2 other parcels he's already acquired. Without it, he's got a gap. She set the package on the counter. Building a position. That's what my husband says. And Harold's been watching this valley for 30 years. Your husband sounds like someone worth talking to. Mrs. Alcott looked at her with a new quality of attention. He's at the hardware store most mornings. He doesn't talk to many people, but he talks when he thinks it's worth his time. A pause. I'll tell him you came in. Evelyn bought 2 spools of thread she didn't urgently need and said goodbye and went to find Dell. On the ride back she wrote, in the small notebook she'd started keeping in her coat pocket, not a formal ledger, just a record of things she was learning, the names and the connections and the shape of the valley's economic life. She'd learned early in her father's house that the people who understood a situation were rarely the ones talking loudest about it. They were the ones listening at the edges, keeping track. Dell drove and didn't ask what she was writing. After a while he said, Alcott talked to you about Crow? Indirectly. Harold Alcott's got more information about this county than any 10 other men combined. He runs it through his store like a clearinghouse. Mrs. Alcott said he's at the hardware store mornings. Dell glanced at her. She said that? Is that significant? Means she trusts you. He looked back at the road. Harold Alcott doesn't talk to people he doesn't know. His wife directing someone to him as he paused. It's not nothing. Evelyn wrote that down too. Tom Whitfield was a lean, sun-dried man of about 50 who had the quiet dignity of someone who had worked hard for a long time and was tired in a way that went bone deep but hadn't yet given up. Colton brought Evelyn along when he rode over to talk to him, which she hadn't expected. He'd simply said, "Come," that morning, and she'd come, and they'd ridden the 3 miles to the Whitfield place in the early cold of a November morning. Whitfield met them at the fence. He had the look of a man who knew what was coming and had been bracing for it. "Colton," he said. Then he looked at Evelyn with a kind of curiosity that wasn't unfriendly. "This your wife?" "Yes," Colton said, and then added, "She's been going through our books. She's the one who pointed out we needed to talk." Whitfield looked at her more carefully. "That right. I think you've had a harder 2 years than you let on," Evelyn said. "And I think someone from Denver has been talking to you about the North Parcel." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "Word gets around." "It does." She kept her voice level. "We're not here to push you. We know this is your land and your decision. But Colton's been a neighbor for 11 years, and Crow's been a neighbor for 6 weeks, and if you're going to consider offers, we'd like to be one of them. I don't know what Colton could offer me that." "Nothing yet," Colton said. "I'm not here with numbers. I'm here to ask you to wait 2 weeks before you say yes to anyone. Just 2 weeks. Let me get to the bank and figure out what's possible." Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. The wind had come up while they were standing there, the kind of late fall wind that had weight to it, that arrived with a kind of announcement. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks. Another pause. "Mira's been asking me not to sell," Whitfield said. "That's my wife. She grew up on this land, same as I did. She doesn't want to be the one who lets it go." He looked at the ground. "But I've got bills I can't keep pushing." 2 weeks, Colton said again. "That's all I'm asking." Whitfield nodded. 2 weeks. He looked at Evelyn one more time. "You're the one from Missouri." "Yes. Town was talking about you. Said you were—" He stopped, apparently reconsidering what the town had said. "Said you'd come a long way." "I have," she said. He nodded again, and they left it at that, and rode home with the wind at their backs, and the mountains turning the color of iron in the afternoon light. On the way back, Colton said, "You said the right thing to him." I said the honest thing. They're usually the same. He rode for a moment. "Not always." "No, not always." She adjusted her grip on the reins. "What are the chances the bank will work with you?" "Fair. I've got good standing with them. The question is whether what I can offer Whitfield is enough to make waiting worth it for him. Is there anything on the ranch we could move sooner? The equipment loan. If you paid it down faster in the next 2 weeks, that might improve your position with the bank." Colton turned to look at her as they rode. "We'd have to redirect the cash from somewhere. The feed order I placed, I ordered 2 months' worth because the price was better. But if we need liquidity in the short term, I can adjust. Order 1 month, free up the difference." He was quiet. "I'm not saying do it," she said. "I'm saying it's an option." "You were running numbers on this before we rode over there," he said. "On the way over, yes, I had an hour." He looked at the road ahead. "You want to run a ranch," he said. "Not accusing, just observing." "I want this ranch to be all right," she said. "That's what I want." He didn't say anything for a while. The horses moved steadily north, familiar with the road. Finally, redirect the feed order. "Talk to Dell about what we need to carry us the month and what we can cut without hurting the herd." "All right. And thank you," he said, with the slightly effortful quality of a man who meant it but wasn't practiced at saying it, "for coming today. I should have said that earlier." "You said, 'come,'" she pointed out. That was enough. He made the sound, the almost law. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it was." The first time Marcus Crow came to Vane Ranch, he came uninvited, on a Wednesday afternoon when Colton was out with Dell on the north pasture, and Evelyn was the only one in the main house. She heard the horses in the yard and looked out the kitchen window and saw 2 men she didn't know, and then a third well-dressed, perhaps 45, with the kind of face that was arranged for confidence rather than expressing it naturally. He walked toward the porch like he had been there before, which he hadn't. She went to the door before he could knock. He stopped on the bottom porch step and looked up at her, and something moved briefly in his expression: surprise, maybe, or recalculation, and then the polished manner settled back into place and he smiled. "Mrs. Vane," he said. "Marcus Crow. I was hoping to speak with your husband." "He's not here," she said. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I wouldn't want to trouble you with business matters. My husband and I discuss all business matters together. You're welcome to leave a message, or come back Thursday morning." Crow looked at her for a moment. The smile stayed where it was, which meant it wasn't a real smile. "You're not what I expected," he said, "from what I'd heard." "What had you heard?" "That Colton Vane had taken a mail-order bride. From back east." He said it in the tone of a man who thought the information was sufficient commentary. "From Missouri," Evelyn said, specifically. "And you manage the business affairs." Among other things, he looked at her with a different quality of attention, now, something that was measuring rather than dismissing. "I'd like to talk to your husband about a mutual interest. The North Fork water rights and a parcel currently owned by Tom Whitfield. I think there may be an arrangement that benefits everyone in the valley." "Generous thinking," Evelyn said. "What kind of arrangement?" "A cooperative water management agreement. A few of the larger operations in the county pooling access to key water sources, more efficient than each operation managing independently." "Managed by whom?" A brief pause. "By a governing body composed of participating landowners. With equal votes?" "Weighted by acreage," she looked at him. "So managed by whoever has the most acreage." Crow's smile adjusted slightly. "In a manner of speaking, it ensures that those with the greatest stake have proportional influence. And what's your current acreage in this county, mister?" "Crow?" The pause this time was longer. "I have interests in several parcels." "You have interests," she said, "but no principal residence and no operating ranch, which would make you a managing party without personal exposure to the outcomes." She tilted her head slightly. "I'll tell my husband you came. If he wants to discuss a water management agreement, he'll reach out." Crow looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking, which was long enough that she could see him deciding something. Then he nodded a short, deliberate nod. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Vane, of course." He went back to his horse. She watched from the doorway until they'd ridden out of the yard, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and wrote every detail of the conversation in the small notebook, including the exact language he'd used about the weighted votes, because she thought the exact language mattered. When Colton came in that evening, she had the notebook open and waiting. He read her notes standing up, still in his work coat. His face changed as he read, not dramatically, but she was learning his face, learning the small indicators. The slight tightening around his eyes that meant something had confirmed a suspicion. The way he set his jaw when he was angry and managing it. "Weighted by acreage," he said. "Yes. He's got more acreage than anyone else in the county right now. Or he will if Whitfield sells, yes." He set the notebook down. "You pushed back. Carefully. He knew you were onto what he was doing. By the end. Yes. I didn't try to hide it, I thought." She paused, picking the words. "I thought letting him know this ranch won't be easy to manage around was more useful than pretending we didn't see it." Colton looked at the notebook again, then at her. He's not going to like being read by a woman he expected to hand him coffee and say her husband would be in touch. "No," she said, "he's not. That might make him move faster on Whitfield. It might. Or it might make him realize this particular stretch of the valley is more complicated than he thought and redirect his attention." She folded her hands on the table. "I don't know which. I made a judgment call." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "You did." He took off his coat. It was the right call. She let that settle without making anything of it. "Go to the bank tomorrow," she said. "Don't wait until the end of the week." He looked at her. "Crow came here today because he's moving faster than he was planning to. That means something changed in his calculations. Don't give him more time than he needs." She paused. "That's my opinion. Do what you think is right." Colton put his coat on the hook by the door. Then he said Dell goes into town Thursday mornings for supplies. I'll ride in with him tomorrow instead. He went to wash up at the basin by the window. "Take the ledger pages you prepared." She'd prepared them 2 days ago, in case. She'd told herself she was being organized. She hadn't said it was because she'd half expected something like today. She took the pages from the back of the ledger and set them on the table for morning. Ethan found out about Crow the way children found out about things, not by being told, but by listening from the hallway. When his father and Evelyn were talking at the kitchen table after supper, the sound of their voices, carrying further than they realized, came to find her the next morning, when Colton had already ridden out with Dell and stood in the kitchen doorway with the expression that meant he was working up to something. "Is someone trying to take the ranch?" he asked. She turned from the stove. She considered how to answer this, not by simplifying it too much, because he was a child who responded badly to being simplified at, but also not by putting more fear into it than was warranted. "Someone is trying to put himself in a position to have influence over how ranches in this valley use their water," she said. That includes this ranch. Your father is working on making sure that doesn't happen. Ethan absorbed this. What are you doing? I'm helping your father understand the financial options. She paused. And I went through the water rights documents in the ranch files last night to make sure I understood what we actually hold and what the legal status is. Ethan stared at her. You can read legal documents? I can read most things if I try hard enough. Some of it I had to look up. She turned back to the stove. Come have breakfast. He came in and sat down. After a moment, he said, Mama used to say that the worst thing that could happen to this ranch was a bad neighbor. She was right. Are we going to be okay? Evelyn put the plate down in front of him. She looked at him directly, because he was a child who needed direct answers and was old enough to know when he was being managed. Father is a good businessman, and he has been running this ranch successfully for a long time. The situation with this man Crow is a problem, but it's a manageable problem. I believe that. She sat down across from him. That's not a promise. Can't promise you things I don't control, but it's what I believe right now. Then looked at his plate, then at her. Okay, he said. Then do you like it here, actually? The question surprised her, which meant she answered it honestly rather than carefully. Yes, she said, I do. More than I expected to. He nodded as though that settled something for him, picked up his fork and started eating, and Evelyn poured her coffee and sat with him in the morning kitchen, listening to the wind move around the house and the sound of the hands starting their work in the yard, thought about legal documents and water rights, and the particular shape of a problem that was still manageable, for now, while it was still early. The winter was coming. She could feel it in the air, not just cold, but a different quality of cold, the kind with intention behind it. The mountains had been collecting snow for weeks, and the first real storm of the season was something Dell had been tracking in the sky, with the certainty of a man who'd read that particular sky for a long time. It was coming. Everything, it seemed, was coming at once. She finished her coffee, got up, washed the cup, and went back to work. Colton came back from the bank on a Thursday with 2 pieces of news, and he delivered them in the order that a man like him always delivered difficult information, the manageable part first, and the complication second. The manageable part was that the bank would work with him. Not easily and not on the terms he'd hoped for, but enough. The loan officer, a man named Ferris, who had done business with Vane Ranch for 6 years, had looked at the ledger pages Evelyn had prepared and spent a long time on the cash flow projections she'd laid out for the next 18 months. He'd asked 2 questions about them, specific questions, about the methodology behind one of the estimates, and Colton had answered them as well as he could, which was well enough, because the numbers were sound, and Evelyn had annotated her reasoning in the margins. Complication was that Ferris had also told him, quietly, at the end of the meeting, that Crow had already been to the bank. Not to borrow. Crow didn't need to borrow, but to inquire about the standing of several properties in the valley, framed as due diligence on potential investment, which was legal, which meant nothing could be done about it directly, which also meant that Crow had access to information about which operations in the county were financially stressed. A bank officer who wanted to facilitate investment sometimes talked more than he should. Ferris told you this? Evelyn said, in a roundabout way. Enough that I understood it. Colton sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold in front of him. He's a decent man, Ferris. He didn't like it. But there's not much he can do if someone comes in asking general questions. How much does Crow know about our position? Less than he'd like. We're in good standing. That's public knowledge for anyone who asks. The specifics, he paused. I don't know. Evelyn thought about this carefully. If he knows we're stable, he knows we're not the weak point. He'll focus on Whitfield, or the Pierce brothers. Does Crow need both parcels? Colton turned his coffee cup in his hands. For the water position? No. Either one gives him enough leverage on the North Fork access. Having both is better for him, but one is enough to make things difficult. Stood up, went to the shelf where she kept the ranch's file of county documents. She'd organized them herself in September because they'd been in a box in no particular order, and pulled out the water rights survey she'd read the night before. She spread it on the table and pointed to the relevant section. The North Fork access right as currently filed runs with the Whitfield parcel, she said. Crow buys Whitfield's land. He gets that right automatically. But look at this notation from the original survey, 1871. She traced the line with her finger. There's a secondary draw off the North Fork that falls inside Vane Ranch's eastern boundary. It's not the main channel, but it's documented as a water source. Colton leaned over the map. I know that draw. It runs maybe 3 months out of the year, spring runoff mostly. 3 months might be enough in a bad year to keep the herd from crisis. And if Crow is thinking about dry years, which he is, that's the whole premise of the leverage, then the fact that this ranch has a secondary access point changes his calculation. She looked up at him. He may not know about it. The notation is small and it's in the original survey language, which is not easy to read. Colton stared at the map for a long moment. You found this last night. I found it at about 11 o'clock. I almost woke you up. You should have. It was 11 o'clock, Evelyn. He said her name with a particular weight, the way he occasionally did when he wanted her full attention. If this changes how exposed we are, I want to know at 11 o'clock. She looked at him. All right, I'll remember that. He looked back at the map. We need to get a formal updated survey filed on that eastern boundary before Crow does his own survey and finds it. Can we file a water use claim on the secondary draw? I don't know. That's a legal question. He straightened up. There's a land attorney in Cheyenne. I've used him before. I'll write to him today. I'll draft the letter if you tell me what you need him to know. He looked at her with the expression she was getting familiar with, the one that was still, slightly, surprised by her, even though she'd been here long enough that he shouldn't have been. Yeah, he said, let's do that. They sat together at the kitchen table for an hour that evening, working through the letter while Ethan did his schoolwork at the other end of the table, occasionally looking up to watch them. It was the first time they had worked side by side on something that required both of them to contribute equally, not Evelyn managing the household accounts while Colton managed the ranch, but both of them thinking through the same problem together, her legal reading and his knowledge of the land and the county's history interlocking in a way that made the letter substantially better than either of them could have produced alone. When it was done and sealed, Colton held the envelope for a moment. This might not be enough, he said. Even if we file the claim, even if the attorney finds something useful, Crow's got money and he's got patience. No, Evelyn said. I don't want to give you a false idea of where we stand. You're not. She gathered the survey back into the file. I know where we stand. I've been through every document in this ranch's files, including the ones at the bottom of the box that were stuck together. I know exactly what we have and what we don't. And we have enough to make this worth fighting for. That's what I know. He looked at her for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up in the way it did in the evenings now, with a cold edge that was different from October's cold, sharper, more purposeful. The first real storm was still a week away, according to Dell, maybe less. All right, Colton said. Then we fight for it. The storm that Dell had been watching in the sky arrived on a Sunday, which was the worst day for it, because Sundays was the day. The two youngest hands went into town after morning chores and weren't due back until supper. By noon it was clear they weren't coming back at all that day, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon the world outside the ranch house windows had become a single white thing with no edges. Evelyn had grown up with Missouri winters, which were cold and miserable and occasionally severe. She had not grown up with this. This was something else. The wind had a sound she hadn't heard before, not howling, not the theatrical sound of a storm in a novel, but a sustained, pressurized roar, like the air itself had decided to move in one direction at any cost. The snow was not falling so much as being driven horizontally past the windows, and within an hour of the storm's full arrival, it was impossible to see the barn from the kitchen window. Stood at that window and calculated. Colton and Dell were in the barn. They had gone out just before the weather closed in to secure the herd in the near pasture and get the horses under cover. She had watched them go and counted the time since. It had been 40 minutes. Ethan was upstairs. She had sent him up when the storm hit, which he had resisted and she had been firm about, and she could hear him moving around in his room. In the barn, Colton, Dell, Pete, and the two hands who hadn't gone to town, 4 men. Horses, cattle in the near pasture, feed and water to manage in this wind and cold. In the house herself, Ethan, and the supply situation she'd been tracking since last week. She went to the cold pantry off the kitchen and took inventory, which she had already done in her head, but needed to confirm with her eyes. Pantry was well stocked. She had made sure of it specifically because she'd been watching the weather the same way Dell had. And while she hadn't said anything alarming to anyone, she'd quietly doubled the staples order the previous week and spent 2 evenings putting up additional stores. Flour, dried beans, smoked meat, potatoes, oats. Enough to run the household for 3 weeks without a supply run. She noted this down in the small notebook. Then she went to the stove and started the largest pot she had with water for soup, Because the men in the barn were going to need something hot when they came in, whenever that was. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs. Is Papa back? Not yet. Should he be back by now? She calculated honestly. Probably staying in the barn until it's safe to cross. The barn is solid, and it's warm enough with the animals. He's all right. Ethan came down the stairs anyway. He wasn't going to stay in his room, she understood, and ordering him back up was not going to accomplish anything useful. She thought about what he needed and concluded he needed to be useful. Come help me with this, she said, and gave him a task that was genuine rather than invented cutting the salt pork into the pot, which required the attention of someone who wouldn't cut themselves and was old enough to work a sharp knife carefully. He took the knife with the seriousness he applied to most physical tasks and got to work, and she watched him for the first 30 seconds to confirm he wasn't going to hurt himself, and then she went to think about the barn situation. The problem she was working through was the cattle in the near pasture. If the men in the barn were managing the horses and the immediate situation, they might not have eyes on the pasture yet. The near pasture had a windbreak fence on the north side. She had walked that pasture twice in the fall to understand the layout, and the herd would naturally drift toward it. But drifting toward a fence in a storm of this severity could mean pressure, and pressure could mean injury, and injured cattle in a blizzard were a serious problem. She didn't know enough about cattle behavior in extreme weather to be certain. She needed to know what Dell's plan had been before the storm closed in. The rope was in the mudroom. She'd noticed it there in her first week, a heavy coil of line that she hadn't understood the purpose of until Dell had explained, in a tone that suggested he assumed she already knew, that in bad weather you ran a line from the house to the barn so that crossing the yard wasn't a matter of navigation. In a whiteout, 20 yards of open yard was enough to get a person turned around and lost. She looked at the rope. She looked at the window. She made a decision. Ethan. He looked up from the cutting board. Keep the heat low under that pot and don't let it boil. Stir it if it starts to go. He understood immediately what she was about to do because he was a ranch child and he knew what the rope was for. You can't go out there. I'm going to the barn, Papa said. Your father is in the barn and I need to talk to him about the pasture cattle. She was already putting on her heaviest coat, the one she'd bought in Clearwater for this specific purpose 2 weeks after she'd arrived. I'm going along the rope. I won't let go of it. 10 minutes. Evelyn. Stir the pot if it starts to bubble. She tied the rope end around her wrist and opened the back door, and the wind hit her like something solid. Crossing the yard was an experience she didn't have language for yet. The rope was the only coherent thing in a world that had become entirely sensation cold, that was past the point of cold and into something else. Wind that pushed against her chest, hard enough that she had to lean into it. Snow that wasn't flakes so much as particles being driven at velocity. Kept one hand on the rope and moved hand over hand, keeping low, and covered the 20 yards to the barn by feel and time, and the absolute certainty that she was going to let go of the rope over her dead body. The barn door was on the south side, out of the worst of the wind. She got her fingers around the handle and hauled it open and fell inside. Contrast was violent from the roar and the cold to warmth and animal smell and relative quiet. Dell was at the far end, checking the horses. Pete was near the door, stacking additional hay. Colton was at the cattle pen gate, and he turned when she came in, and his face went through 3 things in rapid succession that she catalogued and set aside for later. He started. The near pasture, she said. Her voice was rougher than she expected from the cold. The herd. Do you have someone watching the windbreak fence? If they drift against it in this wind. She watched him process this. He turned to Dell before she'd finished the sentence. Dell. Already thinking it, Dell said, without looking up from the horses. We need to move them to the south pen if we can get the gate open. I was waiting to see if the wind shifted. It's not going to shift, Evelyn said. She was stamping, feeling back into her feet. It's going to build another 2 hours, then maybe ease. That's what the sky looked like this morning. Dell looked at her. You read weather? I read what I can learn. She looked at Colton. What do you need to do it? The conversation that followed lasted 4 minutes and resulted in a plan that put Dell and Pete into the near pasture with a rope line of their own while Colton managed the south pen gate. It was not a complex plan. It was also not without risk. Moving cattle in a storm was dangerous for the cattle and for the men, but leaving the herd against a windbreak fence in increasing wind was worse. Colton looked at her before he went out. Get back to the house. I know. She picked up the rope end from where she'd tied it around a post inside the barn door. Ethan's on the stove. Send someone in when you're done, so I know you're all accounted for. He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she'd stopped being able to categorize, not the recalculation look, not the almost smile, but something that had started to come out of its own category, something she didn't have a name for yet. "Go," he said, carefully. She went back across the yard the same way she'd come, slower because her hands were less reliable now, and got through the kitchen door and closed it behind her and stood dripping on the mudroom floor, while Ethan stared at her from the kitchen doorway, with his heart in his eyes. "The pot," she said. He spun around. She heard him grab the stirring spoon. She got her coat off and her boots off and stood at the stove, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that Ethan had made without being asked. And she was shaking in the specific way of someone who has been cold enough and is now warm again. And she looked out the window at nothing but white and listened to the wind and tracked the time. The herd made it to the south pen. It took an hour and cost them a fence post and a bruised forearm for Pete, who'd been caught against the gate when one of the steers panicked. But the cattle were in, and the fence held, and when Colton finally came through the kitchen door at 4:30, he stood in the mudroom with ice on his coat and looked at Evelyn with something that took him a moment to get into words. "The windbreak fence went down," he said, "on the north side, about 20 minutes after we got them moved." She said nothing. She handed him a bowl of soup. He sat down at the table and ate it, and didn't say anything else about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Dell came in 20 minutes after, and Pete, and they ate in the kitchen together because there wasn't any sensible separation between the house and the barn crew when the storm was that bad. Ethan sat between Dell and Pete and listened to them talk about the fence and the cattle with the concentrated attention of a boy who was absorbing everything he could. Later, much later, when Dell and Pete had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Ethan was asleep, and the storm was beginning as she'd read the morning sky to predict to ease its worst pressure, Colton sat at the table with a second cup of coffee and said, "The windbreak fence. Yes, if the herd had been against it when it went down. I know," he looked at his cup. "I would have checked the pasture. Eventually. But the horses were in worse shape and I was dealing with that first." And he stopped. "You got to it before I did. You were managing what was in front of you." He stopped again. He had the quality of a man working at something that didn't come naturally. "You went out in a blizzard, across an open yard, to tell me something I should have already been thinking about. You would have thought of it, maybe, but maybe too late." He looked up at her. I'm not good at this part, saying the thing directly." She waited. "Thank you," he said, "for the rope, for the pasture, for Ethan being okay because you were here." He set the cup down. "For all of it, since the beginning. I've been aware of it, but I haven't said it the way it should be said." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm, and the storm was quieting by degrees outside, and the lamp on the table between them made the room feel smaller than it was, closer. "You don't have to make a speech about it," she said. "I know." His jaw shifted slightly. "I want to anyway." She let him then. She sat across the table from this man she had known for 5 months, this difficult, unexpressive, fundamentally decent man who had offered her honesty when no one else had offered her anything worth having, and she let him find the words at whatever pace they came. "My first wife," he said, "used to tell me that I treated the ranch like it was the thing that needed protecting, and everything else like it was the means to protect it. She meant the people. She meant her. She meant Ethan." He turned the cup. "She wasn't wrong, and then she died, and I kept doing it, because it was the only way I knew how to hold things together. And I told myself that was enough. It kept the ranch running," Evelyn said. "Yeah, but Ethan's been half a ghost for 2 years, and He stopped. "I told myself he was quiet by nature. He is quiet by nature. But he laughed at something you said last week, and I realized I hadn't heard him laugh since before Claire died, and He looked at the table. "I didn't know that until I heard it. I was very careful with what she said next, because she understood this was not a moment that would come again in this form, and she didn't want to waste it by saying something that was true but insufficient. "He's going to be all right," she said. "He's a serious child who has had a serious loss, but he's learning how to be 7 again. I can see it." Colton looked up at her. "He told me last week that he wants to learn to track weather properly. He'd been watching me look at the sky in the mornings, and he asked me to show him what I was looking for." She paused. "I told him I'd only just started learning it myself, and we could figure it out together. He seemed to like that better than if I'd said I'd teach him." Colton's face did the thing she'd stopped being able to categorize. Stayed there for a moment, that expression, and she looked back at him and thought, this is what it looks like when a man who is braced for a long time starts to remember what it felt like before. I've been unfair to you, he said. In a particular way. What way? I've been treating you like you were filling a position. Like you were capable, useful, reliable. All of those things, and I meant them as compliments. But he stopped. You're a person. And I've been exhaled. I've been running the same system I ran before. Just with a different, I've been doing it again. She was quiet for a moment. I came here knowing it was a practical arrangement, she said carefully. You were honest about what you were offering. I don't think you've been unfair. I think I have. She looked at him. All right, she said. Then let's both do better. He almost smiled, the full version of it, not the almost. Almost the full version. Yeah, he said. Let's. Storm aftermath took 4 days to fully manage. Cattle were uninjured but shaken, the technical term for which, according to the livestock disease book, that had been making its way between Evelyn and Ethan, and occasionally Dell was stressed and required monitoring. 2 of the horses had minor injuries from the scramble into shelter. The north windbreak fence needed full replacement, not repair, which meant materials and time. The lane into the main road was blocked by a drift that Pete and the younger hand spent a day and a half clearing with a pair of draft horses and significant profanity. Marcus Crowe did not appear during this time. Evelyn had half expected him to had imagined him using the aftermath of the storm as a moment to press on Whitfield, when the man was dealing with his own damage and might be more susceptible to an offer. She mentioned this to Colton, and he'd ridden over to the Whitfield place on the second day, after the storm cleared, ostensibly to help with fence repair, which was also genuine. He came back with 2 pieces of information. The first was that Whitfield had held. He hadn't taken Crowe's offer, and he was still within the 2-week window they'd agreed on, though barely. The second piece of information was that Crowe had been to the county land office in Clearwater, asking about the status of water rights filings on the North Fork properties. He's researching before he moves, Colton said. That means he's not done. Did he find some of the secondary draw notation? Land office clerk didn't know what specifically he was looking at. But if he's thorough, Evelyn said. He's not a careless man. She went back to the county survey that night. She had been through it 3 times already, but she went through it again, this time with the specific question of what a careful outside observer would find if they were looking for leverage points. She found 2 things she'd noted before, and 1 thing she'd minimized that she now thought she'd been wrong to minimize a notation about a seasonal irrigation agreement between the original Vane landholders and the property that was now Whitfield's, predating the current water rights filing. The agreement had lapsed, technically, because it had never been formally renewed when the land changed hands. But its existence complicated the straightforward picture of who held what. She wrote it up in full in the notebook. Then she went to the kitchen, woke the stove back up, and made tea, and sat with the survey and the notebook, and worked through every possible interpretation she could construct until the clock on the mantel said 2 in the morning. Then she went to the bottom of the stairs and said, Colton, clearly, not loudly, the way she'd say something she meant to be heard. She heard him stir, a pause, then footsteps. He appeared at the top of the stairs in the dim light, hair unsorted, in his shirt and trousers, looking like a man who had been awake for a moment and was deciding how alarmed to be. Nothing's wrong, she said, but I found something. Came down the stairs. She put the survey on the kitchen table and showed him. He stood beside her and read what she was pointing at, leaning over the table in the lamplight, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and she thought with the peripheral part of her mind that wasn't focused on the survey that this was a strange life she had built, and stranger than she'd expected, and more real. Irrigation agreement, he said, from 1868, before your family bought the property. It was between the original holders, Vane's father, if I'm reading it right, and the Holt family, who eventually sold to Whitfield's predecessor. I didn't know this existed. It's at the bottom of the original land grant package, in handwriting that's genuinely difficult to read. She turned the page. The agreement creates a shared use arrangement that runs with the land, not with the individuals, which means technically it still exists, because it was never formally dissolved. Colton was very still. What does that mean? I don't know exactly. That's the attorney's question. But if the agreement still holds, it might mean that this ranch has a documented historical relationship with the Whitfield parcel that predates Crowe's interest by 50 years. And that might matter in a legal filing. He straightened up. Looked at her. You found this at 2 in the morning. Found it at 1:30. It took me 30 minutes to understand what I was looking at. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that expression she'd categorized and recategorized. Then he said something she hadn't heard from him before and didn't expect. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and it has nothing to do with the survey." She looked at him. "When you went across that yard in the blizzard," he said, I was angry for about 10 seconds. And then he stopped. "I've been a lot of things since you got here. I've been impressed, which I didn't expect. I've another stop. I've been grateful, which I did expect, but not to this degree. And since that blizzard, I've been something else I don't have a clean word for." She waited because he was getting to it, and she didn't want to put the word in his mouth for him. "I don't want this to be only practical anymore," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say. I don't know where you are. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say it straight." She looked at him for a long time in the kitchen of the house that was starting to feel like hers, at this man who had trouble saying things directly and was trying anyway. "I haven't wanted it to be only practical for a while," she said. "I just wasn't sure it was useful to say so." He looked at her. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do. Before he reached out and put his hand over hers, on the table, very simply, without ceremony, the way he did most things. Turned her hand over, let his clothes around it. They stood there in the kitchen at 2 a.m, with the survey spread between them and the lamp burning low, and the storm-cleared Wyoming winter pressing cold and quiet against the windows, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said right then. The attorney's letter was in the mail the next morning. The Whitfield conversation would come, Crow would make his next move, and they would answer it. There was still a great deal of hard work between this moment and any version of the future she could see clearly. But she was here. She had chosen to be here. And for the first time since the train had pulled out of the Missouri station, with her sitting in it, she felt something that was not merely the satisfaction of being useful or the relief of having made a defensible decision. She felt in the most uncomplicated way she'd ever felt anything at home. The attorney's name was Gerald Pruitt, and he wrote back from Cheyenne in 11 days, which was faster than Colton had expected, and suggested either that the matter was simpler than they'd feared or more urgent than they'd hoped. It was both. Pruitt's letter was 3 pages, written in the compressed, exact language of a man who billed by the hour and had learned that clarity was the most efficient form of legal communication. Core of it was this: the 1,868 irrigation agreement that Evelyn had found in the bottom of the land grant package was, in Pruitt's assessment, still legally operative. It had never been dissolved by recorded instrument, which under territorial land law meant it continued to run with both properties. The implication was significant. Any transfer of the Whitfield parcel to a new owner would carry the obligation of that agreement, and the agreement specifically restricted unilateral modification of water access on the North Fork Draw without consent of both parties. In plain terms, if Crow bought Whitfield's land, he could not freely manipulate the water access without Vane Ranch's agreement. He would own the land. He would not own the leverage he'd been building toward. Colton read the letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning and read it again. Then he set it down and looked at Evelyn, who had already read it because she'd been the one to retrieve it from the post and had read it standing on the porch in the cold before she'd come inside. "You found this," he said. "It was in the documents. Nobody found it for 30 years. Nobody was looking for it." She sat down across from him. "The question now is what we do with it." He thought about this in the way he thought about most important things without rushing, turning it over. "We could file it formally with the county land office. Put it on record before Crow finds it himself. That's one option. It protects us, but it also shows our hand." She folded her hands on the table. "Or we wait. Let Crow move on Whitfield. Let him think he's got the leverage he wants. And then when he tries to use it, the agreement is already there. That's a harder play. Whitfield's still at risk. Yes, but if we file now and Crow sees it, he might change strategy. Go for the Pierce brothers instead, or find a different approach to the water problem that we haven't anticipated yet." She paused. "Pruitt's letter also says we have standing to formally renew the agreement and modernize its language. If we do that with Whitfield's cooperation, it becomes much stronger than the original document." Colton looked at her. "Whitfield would have to agree to renewing it." "Yes, and if he agrees, it makes his land significantly less attractive to Crow as an acquisition target, because the whole point of the acquisition was the water position." "Yes," he was quiet for a moment. "That protects Whitfield and us." "It does. At the cost of making Crow aware that we've been more prepared than he thought." She met his eyes. "I think that's worth it. I think making him aware of that is actually useful." Colton picked up the letter again. though he'd already read it twice. You want to ride over to Whitfield's today? I think we should. Before Crow's next move, he set the letter down, stood up, went to get his coat. I'll have Dell saddle the horses. He stopped at the door. Bring Pruitt's letter and the original agreement. Already in my bag, she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd stopped trying to name, and then he went out to the barn. Tom Whitfield read the 1,868 agreement at his kitchen table, while his wife Mira stood near the window with her arms folded and her eyes moving between Whitfield and Evelyn with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to watch people closely before deciding what to trust. Whitfield read slowly. He was not a fast reader, and he didn't pretend to be, and when he got to a section he didn't understand, he stopped and looked at Colton and said, "What's this part without embarrassment?" And Colton explained it in plain terms. Sometimes getting Evelyn to explain when the legal language required more precision than he felt confident providing. When Whitfield was done, he set the document down and sat back in his chair. "So this was always here," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "And I never knew it. Neither did Colton. Neither did anyone, as far as we can tell. It was in the original land grant package, with documents that were never indexed." Whitfield looked at his wife. Something passed between them that was entirely private and took about 3 seconds. Then Mira said, from the window, "And if we sign the renewal, Crow can't use the water position. Not freely, not without our joint agreement." Evelyn set the renewal document one of 3 copies. Pruitt had prepared on the assumption they might need it on the table. He could still buy your land. He could still own it. He just couldn't do the specific thing he came here to do with it, which means he probably wouldn't bother, Whitfield said. "That's our thinking." Whitfield was quiet for a while. He looked at the renewal document without picking it up. "Crow made me an offer," he said, "last week. It was a fair price." "I know," Colton said. "You don't have to explain that." "I want to." Whitfield looked at him directly. "It was a fair price for the land. It wasn't a fair deal, because fair prices for the wrong reasons aren't fair deals. But I want you to know, I wasn't going to sell because I wanted to. I was going to sell because I couldn't see another way through." "Is there a number that would get you through without selling?" Colton asked. Whitfield blinked. "What? A loan. Structured the way Evelyn suggested a while back, relief in the short term, repaid over time. I've got the bank on reasonable terms right now. If you need a bridge, I can probably arrange one." He said it in the flat, practical tone of a man offering a tool rather than charity. "That's not nothing I can do. I'm not a bank. But I can try." Whitfield's jaw tightened slightly, which was, Evelyn had come to understand, what men in this part of the country did when something moved them, and they weren't going to let it show. "Colton, Mira's right that this is your land and hers. I'm not trying to take anything. I just don't want Crow to take it either. And if there's a way to keep you on it that doesn't cost you more than you can manage, we should talk about what that looks like." The room was very quiet. The wind outside was the kind of December wind that had weight, but not violence, not the storm, just the enduring cold of a Wyoming winter, doing its ordinary work. Mira uncrossed her arms. "Sit down, both of you," she said to Colton and Evelyn. "I'll put coffee on. This is going to take longer than 5 minutes." Took an hour and a half. By the end of it, Whitfield had signed the renewal agreement, and Colton had made a commitment subject to final confirmation from the bank, which he was confident about to lend Whitfield enough to get through the immediate financial pressure without the terms that would cripple him. And Myra Whitfield had said, looking at Evelyn near the end of the conversation, "You thought of all this." "Colton and I worked through it together," Evelyn said, which was true. Mira said in a tone that suggested she had her own assessment of the distribution of credit and wasn't going to argue about it in front of the men. Evelyn liked her immediately. They filed the renewed agreement at the county land office on a Thursday. Harold Alcott was there. He came in most mornings, as his wife had indicated, and he saw them file it, and Evelyn thought that was probably intentional on Mrs. Alcott's part, that she'd mentioned his habits specifically, so that Evelyn would understand the information would move. By Friday afternoon, in the unhurried but comprehensive way that information moved in a valley like this one, Marcus Crow would know that the North Fork water position was no longer what he'd thought it was. She was right. Crow appeared at Vane Ranch on Saturday morning. This time Colton was home, in the yard with Dell when the horses came through the gate, and Evelyn watched from the kitchen window as Crow dismounted with the composed manner of a man who had recalibrated and was not going to let the recalibration show. She went outside. She had decided she was going to be present for this conversation, And she walked out onto the porch without asking whether that was appropriate, because she'd stopped managing herself according to what was appropriate some time ago. Crow looked at her when she appeared. He nodded, which she took as an acknowledgement that she'd been right about him reading the situation. "Mr. Vane," Crow said. "Mrs. Vane." He looked between them. "I understand you filed some documents with the land office this week." "We did," Colton said. "An 1,868 agreement. Interesting piece of history." "It's more than history," Evelyn said from the porch. "Current law. Pruitt's letter is clear on that." Crow looked at her. The polished manner was still in place, but something behind it had shifted not to hostility exactly, but to a different quality of assessment. He was looking at her the way people looked at things they had underestimated and were now revising. "You found it yourself," he said. "In the land grant package." "Yes." A pause. "You're not what I expected when Colton Vane sent for a wife," he said, and this time it wasn't dismissive. It was simply an observation. "No," she said, "I'm not." Crow looked at Colton. "The Whitfield parcel is still available. Whatever arrangement you've made on the agreement doesn't change the fact that Tom is under financial pressure, and Tom's financial situation has changed," Colton said. "That's between Tom and me, and what hasn't changed is that the water position you were building toward doesn't exist anymore. The agreement covers both the North Fork access and the secondary draw, which you may or may not have found in the survey yet. I'm telling you it's there." Another pause. Crow was doing mental work that he was skilled enough not to let show on his face. But Evelyn had been watching him carefully since the first time he'd stood on their porch, and she could see it in the stillness around his eyes. "Pierce Brothers," he said, "have been speaking with Harold Alcott," Evelyn said, "about what their options look like. Harold Alcott apparently has a great deal of useful information about this valley." Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then, in a tone that was something she hadn't heard from him before, something closer to straightforward than anything he'd said on either visit, he said, "You've been several steps ahead of me. We've been protecting something we built," she said. "That tends to focus the mind." He was quiet. Then he looked at Colton. "I'm not done with this valley. I want you to know that." "I know," Colton said. "But you're done with this particular approach." Crow mounted his horse. He looked at Evelyn one more time, a long, measuring look, without hostility, something almost like acknowledgement in it, and then he turned his horse and rode out of the yard. Dell appeared from behind the barn, where he'd been very busy with something that required him to be within earshot of the entire conversation. "That went well," he said, in the flat tone that meant he'd been holding his breath. "It's not finished," Colton said. "No, but it's different now." Dell looked at Evelyn. "Pierce Brothers are actually talking to Harold Alcott. They will be by Monday," Evelyn said. "I need to talk to Mrs. Alcott this afternoon." Dell shook his head slowly, in the manner of a man genuinely impressed by something. "You know," he said, "when Colton said he was getting married, I wasn't expecting." He stopped, apparently unable to finish the sentence in a way that was both honest and polite. "I know," Evelyn said. "Nobody was." December moved into itself the way Wyoming December did, not gradually but decisively, as if the calendar were a door swinging shut. The days shortened to the point where the light was barely a suggestion by 4 in the afternoon, and the cold settled in with the permanent quality of something that had moved in and had no intention of leaving until it was ready. The ranch adapted. Evelyn adapted. She'd been adapting steadily since September, but there was a difference between adaptation as strategy and adaptation as habit, and somewhere in December, she crossed from one to the other without noticing the exact moment it happened. Stopped thinking about what the next task was and started simply doing the next task, which was a small shift but a real one, the difference between a person performing competence and a person who had become competent. Colton noticed. He didn't say so directly, which was not his way, but he started consulting her about things he'd previously handled alone, a decision about rotating the herd's winter grazing, question about whether to take on a contract for spring cattle transport that would mean committing 2 of the hands for 6 weeks. He asked her opinion and listened to it, and sometimes did what she suggested, and sometimes didn't, and both outcomes were fine. Because the asking was the thing. Ethan was the clearest measure. Children measured things honestly because they had no investment in maintaining a version of reality that made adults feel better. By December, Ethan had stopped being a ghost of himself and had become himself again, loud occasionally, which Evelyn hadn't known he could be, and argumentative about specific things, and fiercely interested in the weather and the livestock, and in a book about natural history that she'd found in the back of her trunk and given him in November. He still missed his mother. That didn't go anywhere, and she didn't try to displace it. But he was present in the way a child should be present, in the life that was happening around him. One evening he said, "Do you like Papa?" They were in the kitchen after supper. Colton was out checking the horses, which he did last thing every night. The lamp was burning, and Evelyn was mending a sleeve seam on one of Ethan's shirts, and Ethan was supposedly doing his reading, but was clearly not doing his reading. "Yes," she said, "like actually. Not like a ranch partner." She looked at him over the shirt. "Why are you asking?" He considered, because he smiles more now, not a lot. But more than before, he looked at his book. He didn't used to do that. After Mama died, he stopped for a long time. Dell told me once, when he didn't know I was listening, that he was worried about Papa. "Dell worries about everyone," Evelyn said. "That's his nature. But he stopped worrying about Papa." Ethan looked up at her. "I think it's because of you," she continued, mending. "People change when they're ready to," she said. "I didn't make him change." "He did." Ethan was quiet for a moment, "but you were the reason he was ready." She looked at him. 7 years old. She thought sometimes that grief made children smarter than they should have to be. "Maybe," she said, "I hope so." She turned back to the sleeve. "Don't tell him I said that." Ethan's face did the thing. It did the reorganization toward something lighter. "Okay," he said. And he went back to his book, or pretended to, which was close enough. Colton told her about Claire on a Wednesday night in mid-December, which she hadn't expected and hadn't pushed for. They'd been at the kitchen table again. They were almost always at the kitchen table, which had become the place where the most real conversations happened, the way certain rooms in certain houses accumulate significance over time. He'd been looking at a photograph. She'd seen it before, a small framed photograph that lived on the mantel in the front room, and she'd understood what it was without being told. A young woman, dark-haired, with a quality of energy that was visible even in the still image. Colton had brought it to the kitchen that evening, without explanation, and set it on the table beside his coffee, and they'd been sitting with it there for a while, when he said, "She would have liked you." Evelyn looked at the photograph. "What makes you say so?" She liked people who said true things. She had no patience for politeness that was covering a lie. He looked at the photograph. "She would have had questions for you. A lot of them." "What kind?" "About Missouri. About your family. About why you said yes to the letter." He turned the photograph slightly, as if adjusting the angle of a conversation. "She'd have wanted to understand your reasons. She always wanted to understand why people did things. And what would you have told her? If she'd asked why you wrote back to the letter." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd have told her what I told you. The letter seemed honest." He paused. "And that I was lonely in a way I didn't have language for, and the letter felt like it came from someone who understood what that was like." Evelyn looked at the photograph. "She died in this house. In the room at the end of the upstairs hall. Not the one you're in. The one that's storage now." He picked up his coffee. "I moved everything out of it afterward, because Ethan kept going in there, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it wasn't healthy. I might have been wrong about that. I don't know. Children need to be near the things that connect them, even when it hurts." She paused. "But you did what you thought was right. That's not something to be guilty about. I've been guilty about a lot of things since she died. Some of them make sense. He put the coffee down. "She told me, the spring before she got sick, that I was working too hard, that I was using the ranch as a reason not to be present with her and Ethan. And I told her she was wrong." He looked at the table. "She wasn't wrong. She knew you," Evelyn said. "Yes," he looked up. "Still loved me anyway," which he stopped. "Which I didn't always make easy." "You're not easy now," Evelyn said honestly. "You're better than you were, I think. But you're still not easy." He looked at her with something that was startled and then not. "No," he agreed, "I'm not. Neither am I." She met his eyes. "That seems to be working all right." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, the same gesture as before, the one that had nothing elaborate about it, and put his hand over hers. Turned her hand over, let his clothes around it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right. I've been thinking about what this is between us. And I don't want to call it a practical arrangement anymore. Not because it wasn't practical to start, it was, and there's nothing wrong with that. But because that's not what it is now, and I know it, and I don't want to pretend otherwise." She looked at him. She was aware of her own heartbeat in the specific way. She was sometimes aware of it when something important was happening, and her body registered it before her mind had finished catching up. "What is it now?" she said. He looked down at their hands. "Something I didn't expect," he said, "which might be the truest thing I've said about it." He looked up. I know I'm not easy to be with. I know I don't say things when I should. I know there are times when you've been doing 3 times the work and I've been—" He exhaled. "I know my limitations. I'm not asking you to pretend I don't have them. I know your limitations," she said. "I've been living inside this ranch with you for 4 months. There's nothing you could tell me about your limitations that I haven't already identified." A pause, and I'm still here. He almost smiled, yeah. His hand tightened slightly on hers. "You are." They sat there for a while, and she looked at the photograph of Claire on the table and felt nothing complicated about it, which was itself a kind of uncomplicated grace. Claire had been real and important and was gone, and her absence was a fact of this life, in this house, the same way the mountains were a fact of the landscape. You didn't pretend they weren't there. You built your life in relation to them. "She would have liked you," Colton said again. Quieter this time. And she would have said so. Probably at a moment that embarrassed you both. Evelyn smiled. A real one, without guard. "That sounds about right." Crow made one more move. She'd known he would, because the man didn't stop. He'd said as much himself, "I'm not done with this valley," and a man who said that meant it. His next move was more sophisticated than the water position, which told her he'd learned something from the first attempt and adjusted. He went to the county commissioner. The specific approach was a proposal for a formal land assessment of the Northern Valley properties, framed as a tax equity measure, ensuring that the assessed values of ranch properties were current and accurate for county revenue purposes. It was entirely legal. It was also, Evelyn understood when Harold Alcott described it to her over the hardware store counter in mid-December, a mechanism for identifying which properties were over-leveraged relative to their assessed value, which information would then become part of the public county record. She stood at the counter and thought about this for a moment. "When does the assessment begin?" she asked. Commissioner said January. "After the holidays." Harold Alcott had the manner of a man delivering information he'd collected specifically to be useful with it. Crow proposed it and put up half the assessment cost himself, as a goodwill contribution to county infrastructure, which means he has influence over who conducts it. He proposed a man from Denver. Of course he did. She looked at the counter. The assessment would be public record. Once filed, yes. And if a property's assessed value came in lower than its outstanding loan obligations, it would be a matter of record, Alcott said, which a prospective buyer could cite in negotiations. She thought about Vane Ranch's current position. The equipment loan was nearly paid. The bank relationship was good. The ledger was the cleanest it had been in years, because she'd been over it 6 times and corrected everything she could find. But assessed value was not the same as operational value, and an assessor from Denver, with an interest in making numbers look a particular way, had tools available to him. "We need our own assessment on record first," she said. Alcott looked at her. "That's possible. A property owner can file an independent assessment at any time. How much? $40 for a qualified assessor. Maybe $50. I need a qualified assessor who isn't from Denver. My wife's cousin," Alcott said, "has been doing property assessments in this county for 15 years. He's slow, but he's thorough, and his numbers don't bend." Evelyn looked at him. "When can he start?" "He's in Laramie until after Christmas. First week of January, probably." "That might be before Crow's assessor." "Might," Alcott agreed, "if you move fast." She paid for the bootlaces she'd come in to buy, which she'd almost forgotten, and she went home and she told Colton that evening, and watched his face work through the sequence, the tightening around the eyes, the jaw settling, the long exhale. "He's not going to stop," Colton said. "No," she agreed. "But he's not winning either. He keeps adjusting because we keep closing the openings. That means we're ahead." She paused. "We need $40 to $50 for Alcott's cousin." "I've got it. I know you do. I'm telling you what it's for." He looked at her for a moment, and then something in his expression shifted into something easier, something that recognized, she thought, the specific dynamic of 2 people who had figured out how to work together without managing each other. "Alcott's cousin," he said, "the one who's slow but thorough. First week of January. Write to him tonight." "I already drafted the letter," she said. "It just needs your signature." He looked at her with the expression she'd finally decided to stop categorizing and simply accept as the one that meant she had surprised him into something warmer than he knew how to say directly. "All right," he said. He picked up the pen she'd set beside the letter. She watched him sign it and thought about Cordelia at the parlor table, so certain that the joke would resolve into humiliation. She thought about the train west, 3 days of new country through a window. She thought about standing in a kitchen she didn't know yet, with a child watching her learn the shape of her new life, adding salt to a pot of stew. The letter was signed. She folded it, set it ready for morning. Outside, the December cold pressed its full weight against the house, and inside the lamps burned with the stetrifications of things that would still be burning when the cold let up. She was not the woman who had gotten on that train. She was not yet certain what woman she had become. But she was here, in this house, in this life, in this valley where the mountains were still visible, even in the dark, if you knew where to look. She knew where to look now. That felt like enough for a December night in Wyoming, with the work of tomorrow still waiting, and the man across the table no longer a stranger. Felt like considerably more than enough. Alcott's cousin was named Roy Bender, and he arrived on a Tuesday in the first week of January with a battered leather case full of surveying instruments and a methodical temperament that Evelyn recognized immediately as the kind that didn't produce fast results but produced reliable ones. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that rushing an assessment was how you made expensive mistakes. He shook hands with Colton, shook hands with Evelyn, looked at the ranch house and the outbuildings with the focused patience of someone beginning a task he intended to complete correctly, and said, 3 days, maybe 4. I don't cut corners. We're not asking you to, Evelyn said. He looked at her. Harold said, you're the one who understood why this was urgent. Yes. Good. He opened his case. Then let's start with the structures. Roy Bender took 4 days. He walked every fence line, measured every building, assessed the water access with particular care. After Evelyn showed him the renewed 1,868 agreement and the secondary draw notation from the county survey, he asked questions that were precise and answered questions the same way. And on the morning of the 5th day, he sat at the kitchen table with Colton and Evelyn and produced a formal assessment document that valued Vane Ranch at a figure that was, Evelyn thought, looking at the number, both accurate and defensible. More importantly, it was on file at the county land office by Friday, with the clerk's stamp and the date recorded, before Crow's Denver assessor had set foot in the valley. She didn't celebrate this. She noted it in the small notebook, the way she noted everything, and she went back to the morning's work. Crow's assessor arrived the following week. He spent 2 days in the valley and produced numbers that were, according to what Harold Alcott relayed through his wife, notably lower than Bender's assessment on the Vane property, a discrepancy significant enough that it would have been useful to a buyer, arguing that the ranch was overvalued relative to its obligations. Except that Bender's assessment was already on record, filed first, conducted by a man with 15 years of county history and no connections to Denver. When Pruitt was informed by letter, he wrote back within a week to say that a first-filed independent assessment by a qualified county assessor carried legal presumption of accuracy, and that a subsequent assessment by an out-of-county party with a demonstrated financial interest in the outcome would face significant challenge if used as the basis for any legal or financial action. Crow's approach, in other words, was blocked a second time. Colton read Pruitt's letter and then set it on the table and sat with it for a moment, in the way he sat with things that mattered. He's going to try something else, he said. Yes, Evelyn said. But he's running out of clean approaches. She poured coffee and sat across from him. Every time he moves, it costs him something: money, time, credibility with the county officials he needs to work with. He's not used to a target that moves before he gets there. We've been lucky, we've been prepared. She looked at him directly. Not the same as lucky. He looked at her for a moment. No, he said, it's not. He picked up his coffee. Pruitt's coming up from Cheyenne next month. He wants to talk about formally documenting the water agreement chain, the whole history of it, as a preventive measure. Make it harder to challenge in any future proceeding. I'll have the documents organized before he arrives. I know you will. He said it without irony, just as a simple fact, the way he stated most things he was certain of. The space between them had changed in ways that were gradual enough that she couldn't have identified a single moment when the change completed itself. It was not dramatic. It was more like the way a house settles into its foundation, over time small adjustments, invisible individually, that add up to something stable. He touched her hand now, without the careful deliberateness of the first time, the way you touched something you weren't sure would stay. He said her name in the middle of sentences, not as emphasis but as a habit, the way people did when someone had become part of the ordinary texture of their thinking. She had started keeping her books on the same shelf as his ranch records, and neither of them had remarked on it. These were small things. She had learned to pay attention to small things. Marcus Crow's last move came in February, and it was the most aggressive of all of them, which told her he was running lower on patience than he'd started with. He filed a formal challenge to the 1,868 water agreement with the Territorial Land Court in Cheyenne, arguing that the agreement was legally void because it had never been formally incorporated into the land transfer records when either property changed hands that it had, in the terminology of the filing, lapsed through non-use and non-acknowledgement. Pruitt sent the notice by express post with a cover letter that was 3 pages long, and underneath its legal language had the quality of a man who was genuinely interested in a fight. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, while Colton stood at the window with his coffee, and Ethan sat at the other end of the table, pretending to read his natural history book, but clearly listening. "He's going to court," Colton said. "He's filing a challenge. That's different from winning one." She turned to the second page of Pruitt's letter. Pruitt says the challenge has weaknesses. The non-use argument is difficult to make on an agreement that was never explicitly terminated. Non-use doesn't void a property agreement under territorial law without specific conditions that aren't present here. Can he win? She thought about it honestly. He has money and he has a Cheyenne attorney who is apparently better than most. So there's risk. She set the letter down. But Pruitt also says that the documentation chain we have the original agreement, the renewal with Whitfield's signature, the filed assessment, the water rights notation is unusually complete for a property this age. He says he's seen weaker cases win and stronger ones lose, Colton said. Yes, he said that too. She looked at him. We go to Cheyenne. Turn from the window. When? When Pruitt schedules the preliminary hearing, which will be within 60 days from what he says. She picked up the letter again. We bring every document. We bring the original land grant package. We bring Bender's assessment, and we bring the Whitfield agreement with Mira and Tom's signatures, because the court needs to see that this isn't abstract, that there are real people on both sides of it with real stakes. The Whitfields would come to Cheyenne? I think Mira would come to the moon if it meant keeping that land. She paused. I'll write to her today. Ethan looked up from the book he hadn't been reading. Are we going to lose the ranch? Both adults looked at him. He returned the look with the steady directness that was his particular quality, not fearless, but unwilling to be managed with false comfort. No, Colton said. Then he looked at Evelyn, a quick look, checking. We're going to Cheyenne to argue in front of a court, Evelyn said to Ethan directly. We have good arguments and good documentation and a good attorney. There's risk in any legal proceeding, but we are not going to lose this ranch. She held his gaze. That's my honest assessment, not a promise and assessment. There's a difference. Ethan considered this. Okay, he said. Can I come to Cheyenne? No, both adults said, simultaneously, and then looked at each other, and Colton almost smiled. The full version, the one she'd been watching develop for months. They went to Cheyenne in the 3rd week of February. Colton, Evelyn, and as she had predicted, Myra Whitfield, who had told Tom to stay and manage both ranches and had packed a single bag with the efficiency of a woman who did not waste time on things that didn't matter. 3 of them sat in Pruitt's office on the afternoon before the hearing, and Pruitt walked them through what would happen and what he needed from each of them. He was a compact man in his 60s, with the particular confidence of someone who had been right about enough things over enough years to have earned it, and he had clearly spent time with the documents Evelyn had sent him, because he referenced specific page numbers and annotation details without looking at notes. At one point he looked at Evelyn directly and said, "The secondary draw notation, you found this yourself." In the original survey, yes. And the irrigation agreement. Same package. He looked at her for a moment. "Where did you study law?" "I didn't. I study whatever's in front of me." He held her gaze for another second, and then he said, "That may be more useful." He turned back to his notes. The opposing attorney is going to argue lapse through abandonment. He's going to make the case that a 56-year-old agreement that nobody knew existed effectively didn't exist. We're going to argue that ignorance of a legal instrument doesn't void it, and that the instrument's terms are specific enough to establish ongoing intent. He looked at Colton. When the judge asks you about the agreement, I want you to answer in plain language. Don't try to sound like a lawyer. Just tell him what the water means to your operation. I can do that, Colton said. Good, Pruitt looked at Mira. And you? Mira Whitfield looked back at him with the calm of a woman who had been keeping a ranch going through 2 hard years and a predatory land investor and was not going to be intimidated by a courtroom. I'll tell him what it means to us, she said. I've got a lot of words for it. Pruitt almost smiled, save some for the judge. The hearing lasted most of a day. Crow's attorney was exactly what Pruitt had described: competent and well-prepared, with a clean argument about the practical non-existence of agreements nobody had acted on for more than half a century. He made the case clearly, and without theatrics, which Evelyn respected, even while she sat behind the railing, and thought through every point he made and how Pruitt would answer it. Pruitt answered each point. He was methodical in a way that had the quality of water finding its way through rock, not forceful in any single moment, but persistent and precise, working through the gaps. He entered the original agreement into evidence. He entered the renewal. He entered the full documentation chain that Evelyn had organized and indexed, organized so clearly that the judge commented on it briefly, without evident emotion, which was the judicial equivalent of approval. Colton spoke when called. He was not a man who was comfortable speaking in formal settings, and it showed, but what also showed was that he was telling the absolute truth without embellishment, and there was a quality to unadorned truth that no courtroom manner could entirely manufacture. He said what the water meant to the operation. He said it in the plain terms Pruitt had asked for. He said that the agreement was not something he'd known about until recently, but that its existence changed nothing about whether it was real, that you didn't stop being bound by something because you hadn't read it. The judge asked him one question. If you had known about the agreement when you purchased the property, would you have conducted your operation differently? Colton thought about it. Probably not differently, but more securely. Mira Whitfield spoke after him. She was not brief. She had told Pruitt she had a lot of words, and she meant it. And what she said was not legal argument, but something the judge listened to without interrupting, which was its own indicator: the story of a family on a piece of land for 20 years, the meaning of water in a dry summer, the way that leverage over water was leverage over everything, and what it had felt like to have someone from Denver come to tell her what her land was worth to him. Crow's attorney objected twice. Both objections were noted and overruled. Evelyn did not speak. She was not a party to the case. She sat behind the railing and listened and took notes in the small notebook, and at one point Crow, who was seated on the opposite side of the gallery, looked across at her. It was a long, direct look. She met it without looking away. He looked away first. The judge did not rule from the bench. He said he would issue a written decision within 30 days, which Pruitt had told them to expect, and which meant 30 days of ordinary life, while something important was being decided somewhere else. They rode back on the train to Clearwater and then drove home in the wagon in the late afternoon cold. And Colton didn't say much, and Evelyn didn't push, because she understood that he processed things inwardly and needed time with them. Ethan was at the kitchen table when they came in, doing arithmetic that he put away with a studied casualness that meant he'd been watching the road for an hour. He looked at both their faces. "How did it go?" he said. "We'll know in 30 days, Colton said. Ethan looked at Evelyn. "Pruitt is good," she said. "Our arguments are strong. 30 days. He nodded. Then he went back to his arithmetic, or the performance of it. The 30 days were not as difficult as she'd expected. There was too much work for sustained anxiety. The ranch ran on its own schedule, regardless of what was being decided in Cheyenne, and the work of it was absorbing in the way that physical, purposeful labor absorbed worry. Not by eliminating it, but by putting it somewhere you couldn't get at it every minute. She managed the accounts. She helped Dell plan the spring rotation. She worked through the supply orders for March and April, with an eye on the cash position that was now, after the equipment loan's final payment, more stable than it had been in years. She also wrote a letter to Cordelia. She hadn't written since October, a brief note. In response to a brief note, nothing substantial. This letter was longer. She told Cordelia about the hearing, about the documents, about the attorney and the judge, and what Mira Whitfield had said that made Crow's attorney's objections irrelevant. She told her about Ethan and about Dell and about the spring that was beginning to threaten the edges of the winter the way it did here, with the first tentative warmth arriving in small doses. She did not say, "I am happy here," because that felt like the kind of statement that needed to be earned by more time. But she wrote it the way happy felt from the inside, in the details, and she thought Cordelia would understand the subtext. She told her about Colton. Not everything, but enough. She sealed the letter and set it on the table to go out in the morning post, and sat for a while in the kitchen of the house that was completely hers now, in every way that mattered her routine. Her ledgers, her pantry organized the way she'd organized it, the curtains in the front windows, replaced with fabric she'd chosen because they let in the morning light properly, a A small thing that had been the first purely aesthetic decision she'd made in this house, and that Colton had looked at when he came down one morning and said, "That's better," and then gone to make coffee, and that had been enough. Pruitt's decision arrived on a Thursday, not by letter, by telegraph, which meant he considered it urgent enough to pay the rate, which itself told her something before she'd read a word. Colton read the telegram at the kitchen table. His face was very still while he read it, and she sat across from him and waited. He set it down and slid it to her. The language was telegraphic brevity. Judge ruled agreement valid and operative. Crow challenge denied. Water rights and irrigation agreement upheld per territorial statute. Full written decision to follow. Congratulations. Pruitt. She read it twice, set it down. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. "It's over," Colton said. "The court case is over. Crow's still in the valley, I know, but he's out of approaches." He picked up the telegram again. "He'll move on to somewhere easier. That's how men like him work. They don't stop, but they redirect. We've cost him enough time and money and credibility that we're no longer the efficient target." She thought about this. He was right. The efficiency calculation was real. "He'll find somewhere else," she said. "Yes." Colton set the telegram down. "And that's someone else's problem." It was not a triumphant statement. It was the statement of a man who had enough of his own to manage and was not going to borrow someone else's weight. She understood it perfectly, because it was also how she thought. "We should tell Whitfield," she said. "I'll ride over this afternoon. Send a telegram to Pruitt first. Thank him properly." "You write it," he said. "You'll say it better." She wrote it. She wrote it in 28 words, which was exactly what it needed, and she walked it to the telegraph office herself, because she wanted the walk, the cold air, the particular quality of a winter morning that was already thinking about becoming something else. On the way back, she stopped at the Alcott store, because Mrs. Alcott deserved to hear it directly. Mrs. Alcott listened to the summary with the quality of attention she applied to everything important, and then she said, "Harold will want to know." She went to the doorway of the back room. Harold Alcott appeared, as he almost always did, with the expression of a man interrupting something important. He listened to Evelyn repeat the essential points. Then he said "good," in the tone he used when he meant much more than one syllable, but had decided one syllable was sufficient. "Thank you," Evelyn said, "for your cousin Roy does good work." "He does. And for all of it, the information, the access." She met his eyes. "You didn't have to." Harold Alcott looked at her for a moment, with the manner of a man unaccustomed to being thanked directly and deciding what to do with it. "This valley works better when the right people stay in it," he said finally. "That's all." She walked home through the cold with that in her coat pocket alongside the small notebook, and she thought about what it meant to be considered one of the right people in a place. She had been in this valley for 5 months. She had come as a joke, a prank, a letter sent without consent to a stranger in Wyoming. She had come as the woman nobody had chosen on purpose. She had become, without particularly planning to, someone this valley was better for having. She didn't say this to herself with pride exactly. It was more that she noticed it, the way you noticed weather as a fact, external and real, that required honest acknowledgement. Cordelia came in April. She wrote first, asking if she could visit, which Evelyn had not expected. She had expected, perhaps, a polite letter of congratulation, when the news of the legal victory filtered back through whatever network connected Missouri to Wyoming in the consciousness of the Hartwell family. She had not expected, "I would like to come and see where you are. If that's all right." It was all right. Cordelia arrived on a Thursday afternoon on the same train Evelyn had taken 7 months ago, and Evelyn met her at the Clearwater station, and they looked at each other on the platform for a moment, in the way of people who have known each other their entire lives and are meeting after a change that has made one of them someone slightly different. Cordelia was still herself, the dark hair, the confidence, the way she moved through a space. But she was looking at Evelyn with an expression that Evelyn had not seen from her before. Something that was trying to recalibrate what it was looking at. "You look different," Cordelia said. "I'm not different," Evelyn said. "I'm the same. This place just makes it more visible." She picked up one of Cordelia's bags. "The wagon's this way." Cordelia looked at her sister carrying a bag without a second thought and said nothing. She got in the wagon. She looked at the mountains. "Those are large," she said. "Yes, you live with those every day. Stop noticing them for a while. Then you notice them again, and they're still large." Evelyn picked up the reins. "Ethan says you get used to them, but you never get used to them." "Think he's right." Cordelia turned to look at her. "You talk about the boy like he's He's mine, Evelyn said simply. Not the way you mean it biologically, but in every other way that matters. She kept her eyes on the road. He was Colton's son, and he was grieving his mother, and now he's also someone who reads natural history books and argues with me about weather patterns, and can tell you the difference between two types of range grass by looking at the root. He's mine because I showed up and stayed. Cordelia was quiet for a while. The wagon moved north. Are you happy? She said, eventually. Evelyn thought about it with the same honesty she applied to everything. Yes, she said, in the way that's earned rather than given. It's harder than happiness that just arrives. But it stays longer. Cordelia looked at her hands. The letter, she said. What we did, I know, I need to say it anyway. She looked at her sister. It was cruel. We didn't think it would amount to anything which we thought made it less cruel, but that was just the story we told ourselves. She paused. I'm sorry, I've been sorry for a while. I didn't know how to say it without it, sounding like I was only sorry because it worked out. It worked out, Evelyn said, but not because of the letter. Because of what I did with it. She glanced at Cordelia. You're forgiven. You've been forgiven. Stop carrying it. Cordelia exhaled. Just like that, you're my sister. What else would I do with it? They drove the rest of the way in the comfortable quiet of people who had said the necessary thing and didn't need to fill the space afterward. Colton met Cordelia with the careful courtesy of a man aware he was being assessed by someone with strong opinions and was willing to be assessed. He shook her hand. He showed her the house. He answered her questions directly, which Evelyn could see was disorienting for Cordelia in the best possible way. She was accustomed to men who answered questions with the amount of information they judged appropriate, rather than the amount asked for. Ethan was the real surprise. He appeared for supper and sat across from Cordelia and regarded her with the specific attention he gave to new things. And within 20 minutes, he was explaining to her, with the enthusiasm he had been building all winter, difference between two types of cloud formations and what each one meant about the weather that was coming. Cordelia listened to every word. She was good at that, when she chose to be really listening, giving it her full attention. She asked a question at the end that showed she'd understood what he'd said, and Ethan sat back slightly with the expression of someone who had not expected to be heard and was gratified. Later, when Ethan had gone to bed and Colton had said goodnight with the straightforward ease of a man who didn't perform social occasions but didn't avoid them either, Cordelia sat with Evelyn in the kitchen and looked around at the curtains and the organized shelves and the ledger on the corner of the table and the small notebook that lived beside it. You built all of this, Cordelia said. We built it. Colton's been building it for years. You know what I mean? Evelyn looked at the kitchen. I know what you mean. When we sent that letter, Cordelia stopped. We thought you were plain and quiet, and that a man looking at a picture of our family would see you and see. She stopped again. The leftover, Evelyn said. Cordelia's face changed. You heard us say that. Through a door I wasn't supposed to be behind. She poured the last of the tea. It hurt. I'm not going to tell you it didn't, but it also turned out to be irrelevant. She looked at her sister. Colton didn't want a picture. He wanted a letter. And the letter was mine. Even the one you wrote. Cordelia looked at the table. Because it was honest. Because it was honest, Evelyn agreed. Which was the one thing you couldn't make dishonest, even when you were trying to make me look small. You wrote me honestly because you didn't think honesty was dangerous. She paused. You were wrong about that. Cordelia was quiet for a long moment. You're the smartest person in our family, she said. You always were. We didn't see it the right way. You saw what you expected to see. Evelyn set down her cup. People do that. It doesn't make them villains. It just makes them ordinary. She looked at her sister. I'm not angry, Cordelia. I'm genuinely not. If you had valued me properly, I might never have taken the letter seriously. I might have been comfortable enough to stay. She paused. Discomfort was the thing that moved me. Sometimes you need the thing that hurts to get you to where you're going. Cordelia looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone receiving a more generous accounting than they'd prepared for. Miriam wants to come next fall, she said, if you'd have her. She can come, Evelyn said. She'll have to help with the fall supply inventory. I put everyone to work. Cordelia almost laughed. Almost. She won't like that. Then she'll learn something about herself. Evelyn stood and took the cups to the basin. Come to bed. I'll show you the east pasture tomorrow morning. Spring grass is just starting. There is something that this story insists on, if you look at it honestly. It is not a story about a woman who was saved by a man's offer. Evelyn Hartwell did not go west because she was desperate. She went because she was paying attention to her own life. to the specific nature of the trap she was in, to the fact that discomfort was information, and information required a response. She went because she had the particular courage that looks, from the outside, like recklessness, but is actually the clearest kind of thinking. The recognition that staying in a place where you are not seen is its own form of damage, slow and cumulative and very hard to repair. She was not exceptional in the ways that stories usually require their heroines to be. She was not beautiful or charming or effortlessly capable. She made errors in the ledger and corrected them. She said things at wrong moments and sometimes said nothing when she should have spoken. She was too sharp at times and not patient enough at others. She brought a woman's full, complicated, imperfect self to a life that required her to invent herself from the inside out in a landscape that owed her nothing and gave her everything. What she had was attention and honesty and the willingness to do the unglamorous thing as many times as it needed doing the accounts, the water hauling, the documents at 2 a.m, the conversations that no one saw but that held everything together. This is what most lives are actually made of. Not the dramatic moments, those are real, but they are rare. The life is in the daily accumulation of small, correct choices made by people who are tired and uncertain and doing it anyway. Colton Vane was not a perfect man. He had spent 2 years after his wife's death running a machine instead of a life, and it had cost his son something, and it had cost him something, and he knew it and carried it the way people carried the weight of knowing they'd done less than they should have during a time when it mattered. He was slow to speak and slow to trust, and sometimes wrong in ways he was reluctant to admit. He was also, in the ways that proved themselves over time, rather than announcing themselves early, a man of genuine quality, honest, fair, capable of change when change was earned rather than demanded. They were taken together, two imperfect people who had found each other through an act of cruelty that neither of them had initiated, and both of them had refused to be defeated by. By May, Vane Ranch was running the best it had in 5 years. The Whitfield arrangement was settled and documented, and Myra Whitfield had taken to riding over on Tuesday mornings to sit with Evelyn over the shared account management. They'd developed a practical arrangement that had become, as practical arrangements between good-willed women sometimes do, a friendship. Dell had hired a new hand for the spring work who turned out to be capable and reliable, which was rare enough that Dell mentioned it twice, which meant he was genuinely impressed. Ethan had begun, tentatively, to spend time in the storage room at the end of the hall, not to grieve exactly, but to sit and to look at the things that were there and to do what the living had to do with what the gone had left behind. Evelyn found him there one afternoon in late April and asked if he wanted company or quiet, and he said quiet, please, and she left him to it, which was the right answer. She stood in the hallway for a moment after she'd pulled the door closed. There was a thing she understood now that she had not understood when she'd gotten on the train in Missouri with her trunk full of books and her practical expectations and her complete uncertainty about what she was walking into. She had thought the question was whether she could build a life in Wyoming, whether she was capable enough, resilient enough, willing enough to make something real out of an arrangement that had begun as a joke. The question had never been whether she was capable. She had always been capable. The question was whether she would be seen. And she had been. Not immediately, and not easily, and not by everyone, but by the people who mattered, by the boy who had started showing her cloud formations, the way you showed things to someone you expected to stay, by the foreman who had started talking to her like a person, before she'd been there a month, by the attorney who had asked where she'd studied law, by the woman behind the hardware store counter who had sent her to her husband, by the man who had taken her hand across the kitchen table at 2 a.m. and said what he was feeling with the effortful honesty of someone who found it hard but found it necessary. She had been seen, and she had done the seeing both. That was the thing she would have told herself on the train, if she could have. Not that it would work out, she couldn't have promised that. That the seeing was available. That a woman who was willing to look clearly at herself and at others and at the situation, and who was willing to act on what she saw, had access to something that no amount of beauty or charm or conventional acceptability could manufacture. The willingness to see and be seen honestly, even when it cost something. That was what had made the difference. Not the letter. Not Wyoming. Not even Colton Vane, though she loved him now in the plain, durable way that she loved the mountains as a fact of her life, permanent and large and no longer surprising. The difference had been her. Her own willingness to say, this is who I am, and this is what I'm capable of, And I am going to go find out if the world has a place for that. It had. It does. In May, on a morning when the first real warmth of the year had arrived, and the snow on the mountains had begun its retreat, and the grass in the east pasture was the specific green of things that have survived a hard winter and come back. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the land and felt nothing complicated. Ethan came downstairs, already arguing with the buttons on his coat. Colton came in from the barn with mud on his boots, saying something to Dell about the north fence that needed another look. Stove needed more wood. The ledger on the corner of the table had 3 things in it that needed her attention before noon. She set down her coffee and got to work. This is what a life looks like from the inside, not the moment of arrival. Not the victory in court, not the sister on the porch with her revised understanding, but this, the ordinary Tuesday morning after everything, with the work still waiting and the people you love moving through the house and the mountains still there where they always were, permanent and indifferent and, once you knew how to look, extraordinarily beautiful. She had come to Wyoming as a joke. She had stayed as herself. And that in the end was the only story worth telling.